Percy raised an eyebrow as he examined the footprints a little more closely through Mickey's eyes. Only 2 sets? They should have sent more, shouldn't they? Hadn't they heard about the dead blues from Femel's house? Then again, Percy expected the people hunting them to be somewhat disjointed. There was the divine root which was looking to punish him for his crimes and potentially extract his secrets. Then, there were the families of the Greenborns he'd killed that had a personal vendetta against him. Finally, there were the rest of the noble houses. He imagined that many of them would steer clear of the mess entirely, for all sorts of reasons. They might not have the spare manpower to send after him, or their headquarters might simply be located too far from the regions where he and Mickey were active in. But there should be plenty of families that couldn't wait to join the fun. A few would do it out of zealous reverence to their gods, while some might do it out of a selfish interest to get their hands on the Aurora Dew as soon as possible. Most of them, however, would be after the bounties. According to Nesha, news of his exploits had already reached every corner of the continent, and the Root had placed a rather generous prize on all of their heads. 30 million contribution points for each of them, Percy, Nesha, and Mickey. Twice as much if they were brought in alive. Percy had been surprised to hear that the Root was okay with him dying, but it hadn't taken him long to figure out why. Other than the fact that he'd pissed them off thoroughly, they were probably counting on Orin to eventually spill the recipe in Percy's stead. Luckily, Elaine's involvement with them was still unknown. As for Nesha, she was currently keeping her head low, trying to avoid anyone recognizing her. But 120 million contribution points for just Percy and Mickey was still a colossal sum. It was worth nearly twice as much as the elixir Percy had looted from House Tantalus. It was enough to last a medium-sized house for years, and this was without even including Percy's spoils from all his fallen enemies, which everyone likely understood had already accumulated into another sizable stash. Mickey, maybe I should turn you in myself. Not if I do it first. Percy chuckled, before focusing back on the task at hand. In all seriousness, things had gotten quite dangerous. Hunting him and Mickey down was already a profitable venture even from a purely financial standpoint. Several noble houses would find it worth their time to freeze their other operations, delegating some of their blues to this mission instead. As for the 2 they had already killed, they had probably been outliers. Dispatched by Femel's father as soon as he'd learned of the Greenborn's death, they had likely headed out even before the bounty had been put in place. On top of that, they'd had a specialized means to track them down, so it was no wonder that they'd reached them ahead of the pack. But Percy fully expected the situation to grow even more hectic over the next few weeks. It's not all bad though, he thought with a shrug. The good news was that each of these groups wanted to get to him first. After all, nobody wanted to share the spoils with others. It meant that his enemies weren't necessarily communicating with one another. Most of them would underestimate his fighting strength and pay the price. Mickey, for now let's collect some information on them. Do you think you can locate them without being seen? I'll change spots in the meantime to gauge their reaction. If his suspicions were correct, these people weren't affiliated with Femel's house. They'd probably just spotted him and Mickey flying toward the mountain and followed them here. Luckily, this was something they could easily verify. This tale has been unlawfully lifted from Novelbin. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. Taking a few deep breaths, he activated his boosting art. Next, he headed west and downward, descending from the mountain while using the snow-covered boulders as cover. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mickey caught sight of the blues. Flying a few kilometers away, he had an easier time observing them through soul vision, since the blizzard didn't inhibit it. As for their targets, they didn't seem to have realized they'd been discovered. Sure enough, there were only 2 of them again. But that was all the crow could discern from this distance. The good news was that they'd kept traveling in the same direction, unaware that they wouldn't find Percy there. Okay, it seems it was just a coincidence they were headed toward me before. We can probably avoid them entirely if we want. Votes. I think we should deal with them now, Mickey said. I agree, the clone added. Percy nodded. Even if they didn't have a bloodline to locate him, leaving these people alive would be a hidden danger. The region was bound to get quite crowded once more hunting parties arrived. So it was probably in Percy's best interest to thin the herd with every opportunity. Of course, the previous battle had made him quite wary towards the Blues. Even with just 2, he'd be a fool to underestimate them. At the same time, the fact remained that neither he nor Mickey could grow without risk. Try to get a little closer. It's better if they don't see you, but it's not the end of the world if they do. We need to figure out what we're dealing with. Percy circled around the Blues, making his way toward his familiar. He wanted to be ready to help the Crow if they got spotted. Approaching by another kilometer, Mickey was finally able to make a few more details out. There was a man and a woman. The latter appeared like an older Orangeborn, though the man was probably younger. This was already great news. It likely meant they were weaker than the previous team. Adding the fact that Percy and Mickey had grown stronger, he felt confident about their odds. Getting even closer, the Crow caught a fleeting glimpse of their insignia. From what little Percy and Mickey managed to piece together, it depicted an animal they couldn't quite recognize, doing something with 2 objects. He scratched his head. A dog hiding behind a couple of bushes? Or a hedgehog sitting between a pair of rocks? Google cnovelfire.net. Struggling to connect it to any of the families in his memory, he turned to the one person who was 100 times more knowledgeable than him about these things. Hey, other me, can you ask Nesha if she recognizes this symbol? Sending the mental image over, he waited for a response. Luckily, it didn't take long for his girlfriend to relay the information he needed. A lion sleeping on its front paws. House Hypnos. Percy felt the urge to slap himself for failing to recognize the insignia of a great house, especially since he'd seen some of their nobles from afar during the past few weeks. Either way, it made sense for them to be among the first to come after him. Many of the surrounding areas belonged to their house. They had plenty of greens and blues deployed in the wildlands, capturing beasts to send to the valley. If we're lucky, we'll counter their bloodline too. Percy couldn't be certain that they both possessed their family's famous ability of lulling beasts to sleep, but he was willing to bet at least one of them did. Why else would they have been sent to this region? He also didn't know if the bloodline worked on people, but he was confident his insomnia trait would protect both him and his familiar from it, if it did. Its effectiveness had been limited against the demonic infestation that had devastated Amanthes, but he doubted the bloodline would be nearly as powerful. After all, the infestation had even forced a goddess into deep slumber, and Percy had still managed to stay awake for over an hour under its influence. That should be plenty of time to finish the fight, as long as the Blues' ability didn't somehow surpass the world-ending disaster. That still leaves 2 unknown affinities and 1 potential bloodline to be careful of, but I feel good about it, he said as he got closer to Mickey. The Crow didn't get a chance to respond, however, since their opponents had finally noticed his gaze. Turning around, the 2 shot toward the bird. The woman was riding a rolling mound of dirt and stone that carved a wide path through the frozen slope. As for the man, he had formed 2 cyan discs beneath his feet, using them to slide down the mountain rapidly. Earth and pure. Percy couldn't help but grin. He didn't want to get ahead of himself and end up dying due to carelessness, but this was looking like an easy fight. Let's not split them up this time, he said, getting a nod back. It was tantamount to handicapping themselves, but this was a good opportunity to learn how to fight under a couple of stacked domains. They wouldn't always have the luxury of separating their opponents, and they would likely have to face groups of more than 2 blues in the future, so this was the best value they could get out of this battle. There's the other one, the woman yelled at some point, gesturing at Percy. Both her eyes and those of her partner shone with greed. The poor fools had yet to realize that they were no longer the hunters. 2 domains landed on Percy with crushing force, causing him to sink deeper into the snow, his feet stepping on the bedrock beneath. Rather than panic, he merely grinned, however. As expected, one of them is much weaker than the other. Mickey, do you think you can take him down by yourself? Between the man's pure affinity, his relative inexperience and weaker domain, Percy was confident his familiar could win without help this time, even while having to resist a second domain. To nobody's surprise, the bird sent him a mental nod a second later, already gathering some ice mana to his wings. Trusting Mickey to handle things on his end, Percy shifted his attention to the woman. Contrary to his friend, he understood he had his own work cut out for him. Before the two sides even clashed, Percy felt a strange wave of drowsiness slam into his brain. It nearly caused him to stumble, though he shrugged it off the very next second. There it is. Just as useless against my trait as we thought. The woman's expression lit up with shock, probably not used to her bloodline failing. Certainly not against yellows. But she pressed the emotion down quickly enough. Releasing a lot of earth mana from her core, she sent it beneath Percy's feet. A massive pit opened right where he was standing, as the very landscape flipped, trying to flatten him. Having seen the attack coming well in advance, Percy stepped on a pair of scythes, shooting to the sky just in time. Ironically, his winding corridor technique had already made him a better fighter in the air than he was on the ground, as he could move much faster with his platforms helping him. The shockwave still caused him to sway, the Earth Mage capitalizing on what she perceived as an opportunity. She shot over a dozen pillar-sized spears in an attempt to skewer him, or rather, pulverize him, as each construct was even wider than he was tall. Sadly for her, Percy didn't have much trouble evading those either. The woman wasn't exactly weak, but she was definitely at a disadvantage against him. Her domain was as powerful as those of Percy's previous opponents, and having another stacked on top of it certainly helped. Her earth mana, on the other hand, made her attacks even slower than the water mage's serpents, so Percy didn't see her landing a hit anytime soon. Putting some distance from her, he continued to leisurely dodge her attacks, sparing Mickey some of his attention. To his relief, his familiar was holding his own just fine. Even better, he was actually dominating his opponent. Countless cyan needles constantly pelted the bird's location, but not many of them connected. Between Mickey's superior agility and the frigid gales of wind revolving around him, most of the attacks either missed or got shredded to harmless motes. Even the few that reached him didn't do much damage. At the same time, the crow found many opportunities to strike back. He didn't even spend much of his mana, as his opponent was neither fast enough to dodge his frozen shards, nor strong enough to block them. Several projectiles found their mark every few seconds, leaving the man's body full of holes. In fact, Mickey would have won already, if not for his opponent's bloodline. Apparently, the man had one too, at least, Percy didn't think it could have been anything else. And this one wasn't countered by their traits. Every time the crow landed a hit, the man's wounds rapidly closed by themselves. A rather handy ability. Percy could hardly fathom how many times it had saved the Blue's life in this battle alone. Most curiously, he couldn't spot a single drop of life mana in the man's body. How does it even work? Is it fueled by ambient mana, or is his body just built different from everyone else's? Percy shook his head the next moment, reminding himself that the inner workings of a bloodline were something that even gods struggled to comprehend. Besides, this was neither the time nor the place. If you stumble upon this tale on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Admittedly, he did feel a little envious of the man's ability. Then again, he understood he was the last person on Remier, probably in the entire universe, who had the right to feel that way about another's bloodline. He shrugged. At least, it's more annoying than downright dangerous. The crow would have to inflict a lot of damage in a short amount of time to win, but that wasn't that big of a problem. Everything considered, Percy was quite happy with both of their opponents. Neither of them possessed the means to truly threaten them. That was not to say they would be easy to take down, however. Leaving aside the man's high-speed regeneration, Percy wouldn't underestimate the woman's defenses either. While her speed was sorely lacking, it was clear he would have a tough time putting a scratch on her. Happy to test that theory, he hurled several of his spare scythes at her, turning a few of them invisible. It didn't work. The Earth Mage noticed all of them without exception, even the ones spinning towards her from below. She didn't even bother using her mana or much of her domain, really. She merely retracted a sliver of her willpower, so minuscule that Percy barely felt its absence, forming a protective layer around her body. The ethereal weapons shattered harmlessly against her skin, not even nicking her clothes. Percy clicked his tongue. It was entirely predictable, of course, but she was clearly an even tougher nut to crack than the water mage, thanks to her affinity. Well, if all else fails, we can always just leave. It wouldn't be ideal, especially now that they'd shown themselves and even revealed so many of their spells. But it was better than dying or wasting days fighting these people. At least, Percy didn't think that the Blues had the means to stop them if it came to that. However, he did want to try overcoming the woman's defenses. After all, this was part of a broader issue he was facing, one that he'd inevitably have to deal with, sooner rather than later. During the previous fight, his familiar had risked his life and endured a lot of pain to make up for Percy's shortcomings and give him an opening to attack. New chapters are published on Velfire.net. Percy wasn't satisfied with that in the slightest. There was no way they would survive the coming months if he struggled to injure half the Blues they fought. His movement technique was great, but speed alone wouldn't win him every battle. He sighed, dodging another sluggish wave of attacks shooting toward him. The woman seemed to have realized her spells weren't getting her anything, so she'd started being more conservative with her mana at some point, prioritizing her safety above all else. She was probably betting on Percy eventually making a mistake. Improving my attacks won't be easy. Over the past couple of weeks, Percy had spent some time reflecting on the issue. One obvious solution that he'd considered had been to upgrade his soul harvesters to increase their offensive power. The problem was that his runecrafting hadn't really improved all that much since he crafted the latest iteration of his constructs. If he went all out, he might be able to sneak a couple more sharpness runes on their blades, but that wouldn't change the situation all that much. Yet, elevating the quality of his weapons wasn't the only way to increase his offensive power. As the saying went, quantity had a quality of its own. And if there was one thing Percy's attacks had in spades, it was quantity. Against the water mage, he hadn't felt confident in coming up with a suitable technique in the heat of battle, as he estimated this to be a much more ambitious project than his movement skill. However, there was something else that had changed since then. He currently had a magical pyramid full of Wiseman's murmurs floating inside his soul. In fact, the priceless substance had already filled his head with over a dozen ideas on how to proceed. No harm in trying, I suppose. Their opponents this time were the perfect, if somewhat unwilling, sparring partners. Both he and Mickey could take as long as they needed to hone their magic against them. Even if they failed, they could just flee without losing much, other than revealing a few more of their tricks than they were comfortable with. But it didn't have to come to that, as Percy fully intended to win. Overall, he had 3 separate goals for this fight, 2 of which he had already started working on. The first was to learn how to better endure the stacked domains. They messed with both his movements and his constructs, the immense pressure causing his bones to creak and groan. But it was manageable and a valuable experience to go through. Even if nothing else went according to plan, this alone would make the fight worth it. The second goal was to fight with his connection to Mickey fully open. They wouldn't attempt to cooperate today. Simply handling the excess information without getting in each other's way was a victory in his book. This was also going okay for now, though Percy expected to struggle more once he focused on his new project. Finally, there was the very tool he intended to crack the woman's defenses with. Percy didn't have a complete name for it yet. That would come later once he saw what the technique ended up looking like. But he did know one thing. It was time for the Carnival of the Savage Gods to gain its second parade. A gray streak shot through the battlefield, bouncing from platform to platform around the Earth Mage. It was naturally Percy, who took advantage of his higher mobility to dodge all his opponent's attacks. Domain blasts and stone constructs of all shapes and sizes fell everywhere, leaving the rocky terrain full of craters as wide as houses. As for the snow, it was long gone. The ground beneath the 2 combatants laid bare. No matter what the woman did, she couldn't get anywhere close to hitting Percy. Sadly, the opposite was also true. A storm of burning scythes spun around him. Some he used as footholds, while a few more ended up crashing into and shattering against one of his opponent's domain-infused spells. Most of them, however, broke into pieces on their own, only to regenerate into more copies a second later. Whenever he gathered enough, he sent them after the Earth Mage. Another failure. Percy clicked his tongue as he saw his constructs shatter against the woman's willpower for the 100th time. At least, he had pressured her into withdrawing more of her domain. He'd even forced her to throw some of her mana into the mix. Still, Percy was a long way from inflicting any lasting damage. The problem was that none of his individual attacks packed much of a punch. 1,000 times 0 was still 0. To win, he'd have to somehow leverage the sheer number of his weapons to land a more powerful blow. What if I time all the hits better? It wouldn't be easy. The only way he could handle so many weapons in the first place was by offloading part of the task to his mana. Through his affinity's innate properties, he breathed life into the constructs, merely directing them as they moved on their own. But the harvesters were neither truly intelligent nor very coordinated. Landing 1,000 slashes in an instant was something he hadn't done before. Well, it's worth a try. I should probably change the imagery too. Up until now, Percy had grouped his scythes into tornadoes. It was a relatively simple formation that had allowed him to maintain a lot of them, but it was way too chaotic for his current purpose. To get what he wanted out of the spell, he'd have to switch to something more orderly and densely packed. Scrambling his brain for a few seconds, he eventually settled on something he figured might work. Not missing a beat, hundreds of scythes broke free from the whirlwinds, shooting to the woman's sides. Responding to Percy's intentions, the constructs rearranged themselves into two densely packed groups, their tips pointing toward the Earth Mage as their edges gleamed with unconcealed hunger. The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't lose her composure. Releasing more mana from her core, she shot several large boulders at the scythes, trying to stop the attack before it even commenced. Having expected her reaction, Percy willed the scythes to move out of the way, but did so without disturbing their formation. The harvesters flew in a flexible circle around the Earth Mage, dodging her spells while staying together. Some inevitably got hit, only for their neighbors to copy themselves to replace them. @novifire.net. The formation approached the woman, the scythes inching several meters closer with each violent revolution. They flew faster too, turning into a blur before long. The blue fired more spells at them, accomplishing nothing but wasting her mana. Eventually, she seemed to realize she couldn't prevent the attack, so she switched her focus to blocking it. Giant walls of stone rose around her, encasing her into a dense sphere over a dozen meters wide. She clearly withdrew more of her domain too, as the pressure on Percy instantly weakened. In fact, her companion's domain was nearly gone too, which probably meant that Mickey had done a great job with his own battle. But Percy didn't have the time to worry about his familiar. His new attack had already reached a critical point, requiring his undivided attention. Pushing all the distracting thoughts aside, he cleared his mind of anything unrelated to his constructs. Right as they were about to sink their blades into the barrier, the harvesters turned immaterial. That wouldn't allow them to ignore the blue's domain, but they could at least bypass the physical components of her shield. The very next second, the two spells collided. The battlefield hadn't exactly been quiet before. Between the frigid winds still howling in the distance and the shrill cries of the gray wisps dancing by Percy's side, it had been rather noisy, in fact. But it might as well have been as silent as a graveyard, compared to what ensued. This story has been taken without authorization. Report any sightings. A grating sound split Percy's ears, as countless scythes ground themselves into dust against the barrier. The stone walls crumbled too, one after the other, the colossal sphere shrinking rapidly. The weapons weren't cutting into the material directly, but they did push back against the willpower holding it together. Once the harvesters were gone, the woman lowered her defenses, revealing her shocked expression. She clearly hadn't expected Percy to gain so much ground in so little time. In the end, the attack never reached her, however. Taking everything into account, Percy estimated he'd need to pack 5 times as much power into the move if he wanted to peel the rest of the woman's domain off. The timing could use more work. I need to visualize the attack better. And I have to use more scythes too. The first issue would be easier to solve, but the second was rather tricky. There was a limit to how many scythes could hit the woman at once. The more he added, the more they got in each other's way. Over the next few minutes, he shifted to defense. He dodged the blue spells, slowly rebuilding his flock of harvesters. At the same time, his mind raced at 100 miles an hour, trying to come up with a solution. Eventually, he felt the urge to slap his forehead, realizing that the answer, or a huge part of it, at least had been staring him in the face all along. I don't actually need the shafts for this type of attack. If he focused on just the blades, he could fit more of them in a tighter space. He should be able to produce them much faster too. In fact, the opposite was true for his winding corridor technique. He didn't need the blades if he only wanted to use the constructs as footholds. As for the complete scythes, they were only needed when he wielded them properly with his hands. Putting his new idea into effect, he ditched the useless handles, seeing some immediate results. The burning crescents broke into smaller fragments, their enchantments greedily drinking the ambient mana to repair them. They flew around the woman faster too, forcing her to put her defenses up again, in anticipation for the inevitable blow. Before long, Percy had amassed enough for another attempt. Repeating his previous actions, he watched the blades dig even deeper this time. The attack ultimately exhausted its momentum before the halfway mark. However, had this been the water mage from before, Percy would have probably won already. Unfortunately, his efforts were still insufficient against his current opponent. Man, domains are so troublesome. Zoras, is there no way for me to awaken mine before blue? Doubt it. If you were at green, maybe you could have tried to touch at it. Even then, you wouldn't have been able to do anything particularly useful. But yellow is way too low. Percy felt the urge to curse, but the former god wasn't done. However, you don't necessarily need to possess a domain of your own to effectively fight against one. The only difference between blues and you is that they can manipulate their willpower more freely. Percy nodded thoughtfully. It was a well-known fact that everyone, from reds to gods, used their willpower with every spell. Mana cores passively attached willpower to mana after all, which was what allowed their owners to control it. The potency of one's willpower, as well as their control over it, improved with each promotion. This was why yellows and greens could manipulate their mana with more finesse than reds or oranges. Mages at blue or higher merely took that to the extreme, wielding their willpower as a weapon in and of itself. Percy might not have a domain, but he still had his own willpower. It permeated every drop of his mana, and thus, every inch of his constructs. Realizing he was onto something, he replaced his lost weapons once more, before unleashing another attack against the Earth Mage. This time, he delved farther into the image in his mind, deepening his connection to the harvesters. When they shattered against the stone walls, he pictured his own teeth breaking. He could almost feel the sting of his gums splitting, and the taste of iron in his mouth, or the warm trickle of blood rolling down his chin. He wielded the blades in a less linear manner too. He moved them back and forth, entire rows grinding against the enchanted rock in unison, stubbornly trying to chew through it. The edges sliced through the domain, while the back of the blades phased through the crumbling stone to find purchase for the next push. The constructs still broke by the hundreds, but Percy didn't let that get to him, losing himself in the picture. Bluish-gray dust and flames permeated the area around the shattered blades, breathing life to a strange shape. It was as much a figment of Percy's imagination, projected there by his mutated eyes, as it was an illusion forged out of his fused mana. The shape grew clearer and clearer as the blades continued to phase through the stone and to slice through the domain. The barrier kept crumbling, despite the terrified Blue's desperate efforts to reinforce it. Percy felt his willpower clash against the woman's. If he compared hers to the full moon, his was but an insignificant firefly, countless times weaker. His control of it was much cruder too. Even so, he refused to yield. "You aren't the first blue I kill, and you won't be the last," he hissed through gritted teeth. Pushing the constructs through the final stretch, he saw the illusion settle into place. It was the spectral visage of a colossal beast. It looked like the cross between a lion and a wolf, the skin on its elongated maw wrinkled in fury, as its burning mane flared in the wind. The creature wasn't native to Remir. Strictly speaking, it wasn't native to anywhere, because it was only loosely based on one of the many nameless beasts Percy had encountered in his travels. He'd picked this one due to the strange way that the fangs on its top and bottom jaws curved in opposite directions, which more closely aligned with the way he wielded his own blades. A deep rumble permeated the area as countless cracks formed on the giant sphere. Percy could practically feel the structure giving way under his own teeth, the muscles in his mouth almost aching from the pressure. Then the monster's jaw snapped shut. The sheer force sent a tremor through the entire mountain, as the beast's slit pupils glinted with satisfaction. Its fangs, the few remaining, at least stabbed and sliced through the woman's soul, shredding the silver silhouette into tattered rags as the name of Percy's new technique grew clearer in his mind. Carnival of the Savage Gods. Second Parade. Thousand-Fanged Maw. The clone exhaled in relief as Mickey flipped over the blue's corpse, pecking out his core, and a large chunk of his crumbling soul with it. The man's high-speed regeneration had been annoying to deal with, but overpowering him had only been a matter of time. After all, the mage had probably been in his current grade for years, his strength having long plateaued. His weaker affinity certainly hadn't done him any favors either. Mickey, on the other hand, was still in a state of rapid growth. With 2 fairly recent promotions, just as many new mutations and multiple upgraded spells, he had yet to exhaust his potential. Not to mention that he had a second mind in his body helping him improve even faster. The good news was that their opponents hadn't been from Femel's house this time, making them safe to eat. And there was no way the crow could pass on such a nourishing meal. The Blues had chosen to come after their heads of their own volition, so Percy didn't feel particularly guilty over their grim fates. That said, the taste of human flesh inside his beak was quite disturbing. Doing his best to filter it out, he shifted his attention to his main body. It looked like he was about to finish his own opponent off. The colossal visage of some ferocious animal appeared around the sphere of stone and willpower, chewing through it one layer at a time. I suppose he's figured out whatever he was working on. The clone obviously didn't need to guess, as he could easily access his main body's thoughts if he wanted. He was only ignorant of his counterpart's efforts because he'd been busy focusing on his own fight. Letting his mind blend with the originals, he soon had his answer. The Second Parade, another technique built atop his boosting art. This one elevated his offensive power to a frightening level. Mickey was already done with his meal. The first one, anyway. It was rather unsettling how quickly the familiar could devour an adult human. But Percy ignored that, concentrating on something else. A wave of potent soul mana spilled out of the crow's stomach, permeating his frame. Breaking down the souls he devoured always gave him more juice than a core of the same grade could contain, and this was the first time Mickey and Percy got themselves some blue-grade soul mana to play with. The last people the bird had eaten had been Acton and his group, but all the spare mana had gone towards his evolution at the time. It's such a pity the main body can't circulate it. The problem was that the carnival relied on the constant absorption of ambient mana from his surroundings. This meant that the boosting art was ultimately capped by the grade of its owner's core. At the rate Percy exhausted and replenished his reserves, the extra mana would barely last him for a few attacks. It could still make for a decent trump card in the future, of course. They could take advantage of one of their fallen opponents to unleash a stronger attack against another. Alternatively, Percy could bestow the blue mana to his clones, though there were issues with that too. Sadly, his wisps would struggle to contain the potent energy, as they weren't nearly as robust as his main body. Equipping them with mana that wasn't suitable for their grade and having them carry it around for weeks would be a recipe for disaster. A difference of a single grade might still be okay. Percy had actually done it before, when he escaped from Melodia filled up on Soul's mana. Still, he'd only held the superior resource for a short time. Giving blue mana to his yellow wisps was a bit much. Thankfully, it didn't look like that would be necessary today. Percy didn't need any help to deal with the Earth Mage, and he didn't have an open clone slot either. That was not to say that the blue mana would go to waste, however, the clone had another use for it. Unauthorized usage. This tale is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. I should hurry up. The main body is about to hand us another snack. Drawing a hefty amount of ice mana from Mickey's abdomen, Percy manifested a snowball in their right talon. One thing that sucked about his familiar's body was that it didn't have proper hands, which made it difficult to work on anything delicate. But he knew he shouldn't complain. His friend had it worse, since he was permanently stuck here. In some ways, losing his memories might have been a mercy. It would be nice if I could find a way to improve his quality of life. It didn't have to be a spell to grow hands on a beast's body. They were living in a universe full of possibilities and obscure magical secrets. Surely there was a solution out there. All in due time. Mickey's already come a long way since his rebirth. Percy reminded himself. The crow could already communicate like a regular person, wield magic the old-fashioned way, and didn't even suffer from his bestial hunger nearly as much as he used to. There was still some distance to being able to live in a society, but they were certainly on the right track. In any case, this wasn't the time to be worrying about that. Shaking the distracting thoughts out of his head, Percy's attention returned to the task at hand. Gathering some of the dense mana permeating their souls, he pushed it into the snowball. He closely mirrored the construct's shape, going as far as to trace the faint contours on the object's surface. "Are you trying to fuse them again?" Mickey suddenly asked, causing him to mess up and crush the soft snowball by mistake. His chapter is dated by novel Fire Net. Percy clicked their beak in irritation. "Yes, let me focus for a couple minutes. We don't get as many chances to work on this." Granted, Percy didn't have to use blue mana. It made his life harder, since it was 2 grades higher than the ice mana. The orange and yellow beasts they ate every few days were arguably more suitable for the task. The main body's mana was also a perfect match, and they even had an infinite supply in theory. In practice, the original was swamped with half a dozen other projects, so the clone preferred not to disturb him. That was why he only played around with affinity fusion when they ate something. Pulling more mana out, he resumed his work. There were a couple more complications besides the grade mismatch. Unlike the relatively simple pure mana that he was used to fusing with soul mana, ice was a composite affinity. It was based on 2 other elements, each with its own quirks. Even though Percy had grown proficient with all of Mickey's mana types over the past few months, he still wasn't as skilled with them as he was with his own. But it wasn't all bad. While his proficiency with ice mana could use some work, his skill with soul mana had reached a high level over the years. Even better, fusing his own mana was a routine task by now, something he did passively while using the latest version of his boosting art. This was quite relevant, because Percy was planning to follow a similar approach. He would have his soul mana possess the ice mana, by phasing the former into the latter, having it closely follow its movements and slowly adopt its properties. It had worked for his pure mana, giving him the option of turning it invisible and immaterial at will, so he saw no reason it wouldn't apply here. Maybe it wasn't the best, nor the easiest way to fuse the 2 mana types. Perhaps he could study a better method if he ever got the chance to step in a Morai library, but affinity fusion was nebulous and open-ended. As far as he could tell, there were often multiple ways to combine 2 mana types, and he was confident he was on a viable path. "If this works, I'll be able to send ice mana to my main body through the cord." Percy repeated his actions for a while, trying to stick the 2 mana types together. He copied the same exercises he had used in the Alchemist's Guild, transforming the snowball into all sorts of geometrical shapes, from cubes and pyramids to cylinders and cones, having the soul mana track its transitions. Unless he was horribly mistaken about this, it would only be a matter of time before he succeeded. Half an hour later, he took a short break for Mickey to consume the second corpse. They didn't get as much mana from it, because the woman's soul had already degraded a lot by the time they made space for it. The heavy injuries his main body had inflicted on her hadn't helped. At least, her core was still in a decent enough condition. Diving back to work, the clone exhausted the rest of the stash. The original hadn't remained idle either, cleaning up the battlefield and tallying their spoils. By the time the trio had taken off again, the clone had obtained some tangible results to report. Hidden in the very depths of the snowball, Percy found a pinch of snow that sported a slightly different color. It glinted in a silver light but felt otherwise identical. At least, until he willed it to turn invisible. Sitting on Mickey's back, Percy was preparing the ingredients for his mana threads as he paid the clone some attention. After seeing the latter make some tangible progress with the new mana type, he'd started sending him soul mana to accelerate the process. Another week had passed since the battle against House Hypnos's mages, and the clone could already reliably produce about a talonful of augmented snow every couple of minutes. Only, the substance now sported a dull gray color, as Percy's soul mana was affected by his blessing, unlike the silver version that Mickey extracted from his meals. Given how slowly the clone produced the mana, they weren't ready to use it in a fight, though he was thankfully getting faster at it by the hour. Unlike Percy's original fuse mana, the new resource was multifaceted, however, opening several new doors at once. That was why the clone was currently experimenting with something different. Playing with the two concepts inside the crow's second core, he tweaked the fragile balance slightly, before drawing the ice mana to their talon. Unlike their previous attempts, the manifested construct wasn't solid. Instead, it was a semi-amorphous blob of frigid water that spun and squirmed between the bird's claws. Adding some soul mana to the substance, the clone attempted to fuse it again, only to end up with nothing half an hour later. It's tough. Every time I alter its properties, I have to relearn how to fuse it. The clone groaned. Percy nodded thoughtfully. They essentially had to master 3 new variants of affinity fusion: a solid, a liquid, and a gas. And each of them was more complex than pure mana was. Send some of it back. I want to test it out too. Doing as instructed, the clone produced some more of the gray ice, before turning it incorporeal and feeding it back through the cord. A trickle of mana entered Percy's body the following second, causing his very soul to shiver. "D-damn. This is really unpleasant," he spat through chattering teeth. The clone hadn't suffered this much while doing it in Mickey's body. Other than the fact that souls were inherently more sensitive than flesh, there was another reason why Percy was affected so strongly. The ice core wasn't his own, and thus he lacked his familiar's innate resistance to the affinity. "Will you be able to use it like this?" the clone asked. Percy shook his head. "I'm not as worried about the cold. I'll get used to it. The fact that I don't have a way to store it is a bigger issue." Percy didn't have the right core, though he might still be able to hold the new resource in his channels. Once fully cleared and tempered, all the pathways in one's network had a capacity on par with a mana core. The only question was, which set of channels would the augmented ice mana go in? His pure channels wouldn't work, as they were entirely incompatible with the affinity. His soul channels were better, as they should be able to contain it in its incorporeal state, but there was a problem with that. He didn't have any free space for it. During a fight, his soul channels had to stay mostly saturated with his own mana to keep the carnival active. "I suppose I'll have to clear ice channels in my body," he concluded, not particularly thrilled with the idea. Worse still, once the clone figured out the liquid and gas variants of the augmented ice, Percy might need water and air channels too. At least, he hoped that would work, since the ice mana essentially behaved like either of its components at that point. However, clearing and tempering 3 brand new mana networks would take a lot of time. The good news was that he would then be able to keep plenty of the gray ice in his body. After everything was said and done, Percy would have a buffer equal to 3 yellow cores worth of the new resource. Unleashing all of it at once, he should be able to produce a very powerful sneak attack, without even having to give up his boosting art or leave himself vulnerable. "Do you think we'll be able to circulate each other's mana too?" the clone asked. Support creative writers by reading their stories on Novelbin, not stolen versions. The source of this content is novlfire.net. Doubt it. Their boosting arts required the right mana core to work. Admittedly, there was some flexibility in that, since they could extend the organ's properties to their channels or the external flows outside their bodies. As Percy had discovered, multiple cores could even be forced to behave, not getting in each other's way. Still, there was no way a single core could sustain 2 bodies at once. Certainly not with just a pair of cords linking them. No matter how wide these connections were, or how smoothly they allowed the mana to pass through them. That was okay. Even if they could only store enough of the new mana to fuel a couple of attacks, they should be able to accomplish some extraordinary things. How will you find time for this, though? The clone asked again. Percy sighed. That was the big question, wasn't it? Based on his previous estimates, he would have to spend several months working tirelessly on his silk before he was ready to upgrade his armor. Between his clones coming and going all the time, the constant interruptions whenever they got attacked by their pursuers, and having to keep supplying Mickey's clone with soul mana, he'd never get the chance to clear so many new channels. Closing his eyes, Percy pondered the issue for a while. Eventually, a flash of inspiration hit him. "You'll take care of that," he said before elaborating. "I'll focus on the silk and the clones, and the Aurora Dew, I guess. You'll handle everything related to the new fusion." "Do you think it's possible?" Percy shrugged. "I was able to seize Mickey's mana by force years ago, from dozens of miles away, with just soul resonance. It should be even easier to do something similar with soul harmony. Especially for you, since you're basically me. I think we've been underutilizing our secret art." Ever since he upgraded the spell, Percy had thought of it mostly as a tool to coordinate with his familiar and help him in a pinch. But he disregarded one of the most valuable features of the secret art. No. His entire bloodline. His clones didn't just let him visit exotic worlds or possess other beings. They also allowed him to sprout copies of his mind, to experience multiple lives in parallel. Normally, these versions of Percy had no choice but to do everything in isolation, somewhere far away. Yet, this wasn't the case for the one anchored in his familiar's body and having such open-ended access to his own. Percy continued, "You'll reach into my cores and take all the soul mana you need by yourself. Master all 3 of the new forms of affinity fusion, feed the results back to my body, and use them to clear and temper my channels. I can try, but it sounds pretty invasive. Are you sure it won't distract you while you're spinning the silk?" "It will. I'll just have to get used to it. It'll be easier to adjust to somebody messing with my mana than to find time to do everything by myself. Besides, I don't need as much mana for the threads, so you taking some won't be a problem." "What should I do in the meantime?" Mickey asked, jumping into the conversation. Now that the crow had finished applying regulation to the new mutation and merging the spell with circulation, he was kind of free. "Help the clone with affinity fusion. You need to learn it too, but you don't have to worry about clearing my channels. Instead, try circulating your augmented ice mana in your water and air pathways. I bet it should be possible." Percy wasn't just shooting at random. This was precisely what he'd done to merge synchronization with the dance, so this was probably a key step towards Mickey evolving his own boosting art. Why bother circulating regular water or air mana, when Mickey could triple down on a superior resource that could do all of the same things and more? Of course, Percy didn't think the bird would be able to circulate the soul-infused variants of the mana. Mickey's cores wouldn't support it, since he didn't have the soul affinity, and Percy couldn't possibly supply both of them with enough to fuse all their other mana types with. The soul-freezing ice would be their secret weapon, something they slowly accumulated over the course of a battle, releasing it at an opportune moment to deliver a devastating attack. Percy would keep the stash in his new networks, while Mickey would store it, admittedly less of it, in his soul channels. The good news was that the crow wouldn't have to clear his soul channels. He'd had those ready from a young age. Every time he consumed a soul, the influx of mana exerted a lot of pressure on him, forcefully clearing and expanding the network. Mickey had inadvertently completed the project a long time ago, even though he'd never used it for much, other than temporary storage or to supply Percy with some extra mana here and there. It's nice to have one less thing to worry about, I suppose. Perhaps it might be worth having Mickey clear some pure channels in his body too, to contain some of Percy's old fused mana in its corporeal state. It wasn't a priority, since Mickey didn't have a use for it, but they might as well, just to leave the door open. As for merging all 3 of their affinities, soul, pure, and ice, it would be several times harder, and Percy didn't see a reason to bother with something so tedious right now. Maybe one day. With that, they had accounted for all their projects, other than their collaborative fighting strength. That was something they could work on whenever they ended up cornered by their enemies. It was going to be a busy year, but Percy had all the tools he would need to extract a whole decade's worth of training from it. Seeing the first of the small houses appear on the horizon, Elaine exhaled in relief. It had been around 2 months since they'd left the valley, but they'd finally made it back to the Camelot province. They'd completed the trip much faster than the last time, too. Elaine's higher grade and their insomnia trait had certainly helped, along with the fact that they didn't have to worry about any companions keeping up. They could have arrived even sooner, but they tried not to overdo it, to avoid getting seen running faster than Elaine should have been capable of. They'd also taken a few detours to hunt beasts from different regions. After all, they had to stick with Elaine's story that she'd spent the past couple of years training in the wilderness, so they needed some evidence to back that up. Well, it doesn't matter. We're here now. Percy shrugged. Next, he and his cousin deactivated the nascent dance as they approached the town. A wave of weakness rippled through their body, the bubbles around them bursting in unison. A harmless spray of water washed over the tall grass by their knees, the cool droplets rolling off the long blades. The two had deliberately avoided traveling on the road as much as possible. The fewer people they ran into, the longer they could spend working on the spell. And they'd made a ton of progress with it as a result. Soon after starting their journey, they'd realized the azure ribbons weren't well suited to Elaine's version of the boosting art. Water mana was denser and moved more slowly than other affinities Percy was familiar with, so his cousin had struggled to maintain the elongated whirlpools. Instead, they'd switched to gathering and converting ambient mana into countless small bubbles entering and exiting her body, not too different from her defensive bubble coat spell. In fact, they were convinced she wouldn't have much difficulty merging the two techniques in the future. But that was for Elaine to figure out at a later time, not a priority right now. Another change they'd made was in how she absorbed the mana into her body. Due to its properties, it wasn't practical to have a single drop of water mana travel through her entire network. Instead, she only let the bubbles seep into her skin briefly, moving them a short distance to exchange the primed ambient mana with her own, before pushing them out again. As luck would have it, the wave-like patterns glowing on her body made for an excellent reference point, indicating how far the mana was supposed to travel. Percy and Elaine had observed the best results when they had the bubbles enter through the peaks and exit through the nearest valleys, barely moving an inch through her channels. This gave the whole spell a gentle, if somewhat lazy, rhythm. Of course, her status had yet to register the upgrade. They both understood there were still a few kinks to iron out, but they knew they were getting close. If things kept going like this, they might not even need Galahad's help after all. Between Percy's experience with 2 other versions of the spell, and the fact that Elaine had been working on it for years, they'd progressed much faster than they'd expected. Alas, that would have to wait a little longer, as they were about to enter the town. "Why are we stopping here first? I thought you were in a hurry to see your parents." Percy was also getting a bit anxious. He still had no idea what had happened to Baldy and Galahad after his messy departure from the province. He sure hoped that Deimos hadn't held his grandfather responsible for his crimes. And he didn't know what had happened to House Tantalus either. Having lost so many of their strongest mages, they couldn't have continued harassing his family. Could they? Nesha had tried to ask around during her stay in the city, both times, but it hadn't been easy to get reliable information on Percy's house. The whole continent had been in turmoil since before the Lotus bloomed, with hundreds of noble families at war, a centuries-old house getting destroyed seemingly every month. The chaos was starting to settle, as many of those conflicts had already reached their conclusion. In part, Percy's exploits had helped with that a little, since he had given the nobles another spicy topic to focus on, but his involvement with the Aurora Dew and the Holy Children had actually muddied the waters even more. Admittedly, some concerning rumors had reached his ears, but he knew he couldn't really trust them, as he'd already heard multiple conflicting accounts. Apparently, his family had both been completely razed to the ground as punishment for Percy's crimes, but also elevated to a great house by the Order as a reward for his contributions to alchemy. Archibald was both alive and dead, and Percy himself had been a god all along, having hidden his identity and snuck into the Alchemists' Guild to have some fun. This story has been unlawfully obtained without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. Suffice to say, the surest way to find out the truth was to go home and ask. I am. But I have a few relatives on my mum's side here that I haven't seen in years. It's a good opportunity to stop by, since it's on our way, Elaine replied. Percy nodded, not saying anything else. They'd reach their house soon enough. Besides, they might be able to ask Elaine's extended family about Archibald or House Avalon. Commoners weren't very involved in such matters, but these people still lived in the same province and had strong ties to his family, so they should know more than the rest of Remire. Moreover, Percy was a little curious about the town. He'd never actually visited any of the towns under his family's jurisdiction before, so he didn't mind seeing how they compared to the others they'd passed through during their travels. This was Pinesap Town. It wasn't the largest under his house's control, but it was the one closest to the Whistling Woods. And it was famous in the nearby provinces for a certain edible product native to the region, the whistling sap. It was a sweet, syrupy liquid extracted from the pine trees in the forest. It was customary to give some to young children when they got their affinities tested, celebrating the start of their new lives as mages. It wasn't the most lucrative industry. The income was barely worth mentioning compared to House Avalon's other ventures, but it was a rather wholesome one that nobody wanted to see gone. Of course, Percy had never actually tried the snack. He'd been way too old by the time Elaine and Gawain had escorted him to the temple, and the sight of a teenager eating something made for children would have given people another reason to look down on him. Thinking about it, Percy felt the urge to chuckle. Look at how far I've come already. From being too scared to eat a bowl of syrup to essentially declaring war on Remire. Reaching the town's border, Elaine circled around it, heading toward the nearest gate. The stone wall was barely a meter tall and a foot thick. It was mostly here to keep pests out, rather than any truly dangerous beasts. Not that there were any in the vicinity, since the Whistling Woods were relatively safe. There was only a man seemingly in his early 30s guarding the entrance. His cheap linen clothes betrayed his status as a commoner, probably a resident of the town. His green core would have deterred any bandits from trying to sneak in, though it wouldn't have done much if House Tantalus was to invade. The guard waved at Elaine with a smile on his face. Percy didn't know if the man had recognized his cousin, but he'd certainly recognized the insignia on her clothes. While she still had to hide her grade and her second core, she no longer had to conceal her origin now that she was traveling on her own. The green smile did freeze for a second when he noticed her missing limb, but Elaine waved his concern away, reassuring him that it wasn't a big deal. Wow, I didn't know the commoners in our towns had such a good opinion of our family, Percy said as soon as the man let them in. There's some friction here and there, but we generally treat them much better than other houses. Percy nodded. It wasn't that hard to guess the reason either. Everyone living west of the river understood they'd found themselves on the luckier side of the province. The nobles of House Avalon weren't saints. Even Percy himself had been treated rather coldly by his own relatives as a child. But they might as well have been, compared to the monsters of House Tantalus. And there was another reason his family was better received here. Walking around the town, he marveled at the wooden houses lining up on either side of the street. They weren't very large. He'd seen bigger houses, and not just in Twilight City but also many of the other towns. However, they were in good condition, clean and tidy. Among the residents, Percy spotted a couple people he recognized. Or rather, people whose faces he recognized, save for their dull gazes and vacant expressions. They were carrying heavy-looking crates for the townsfolk. They were clones. While Percy had never been to their towns before, he did know a few things about them. Archibald frequently stationed some of their greens who had the bloodline here, providing the commoners with free labor. A green could have up to 27 clones at once, though they typically only maintained a handful each, so as to not affect their mana reserves too badly. Still, with 2 greens in each town, and given the strong physique that their clones inherited from them, they lent a ton of manpower to their subjects. On top of that, these greens obviously had the life affinity too, meaning that every commoner living on this side of the province always had a powerful healer staying nearby. Thus, nobody had to worry about injury or sickness, not even the Redborns. This was the complete opposite from how House Tantalus treated their own people. Not only did they kill and harass them, they didn't even bother to protect their towns, letting their artificially weakened populations fend for themselves. "I guess the situation has calmed down a little," Percy said, getting a nod back. During the war, Archibald had been forced to deploy more mages here to protect their people. The lack of any visible damage to the structures and the relatively low number of clones walking around indicated that it had been a while since the last raid. This content belongs to Novelfire.net. In any case, Percy wasn't very interested in meeting Elaine's relatives. It wasn't like she could introduce him to them either. And since they couldn't practice the dance while in the presence of others, he had to find something else to keep himself busy during their stay here. Luckily, he had just the right thing in mind. Time to play with my domain some more. Elaine was currently sitting in her aunt's kitchen, dining with her extended family. Or was that her grandaunt? Percy hadn't paid much attention. She looked like she was having a ton of fun too, catching up with relatives she hadn't seen in years. "I have to hand it to Uncle Gawain for not having a stick up his ass," Percy thought. Typically, nobles only bothered to marry a commoner if they were a yellow-born, bringing more talented mages into the family. It was practical, if somewhat callous and transactional. This wasn't what Elaine's father had done, however, getting together with his orange-born wife out of love. This wasn't news to Percy, but getting a feel for Ragnell's humble origins still put everything into perspective. They're all good people. No wonder Elaine turned out so nice. Regardless, Percy was bored out of his mind here. Not only did he not know any of them, but he couldn't even reveal his existence. Admittedly, the roasted duck tasted nice, but meat was all they'd eaten since Twilight City, so he wasn't all that excited about it either. Of course, Elaine was planning to ask them about Archibald and House Avalon later, but she hadn't brought it up yet, probably not wanting to sour the reunion with what promised to be a gloomy topic. Consequently, Percy had no choice but to wait quietly in a corner of his cousin's mind. Luckily, he did have something quite interesting to focus on in the meantime. Filtering out the conversation, he gathered his willpower, allowing it to spill out of his host's body. He let it gently unfold inside the modest room, taking great care not to touch any of the others, else they might notice. He also had to avoid breaking anything or making noise, which limited what he could do by quite a bit. Thankfully, it wasn't his first time playing with his domain. Percy felt the invisible field roll like a carpet on the floor around the table, gently brushing against the wooden planks while enveloping the furniture. Given the circumstances, he couldn't test the range or power of the ability, so he instead concentrated on sensing his surroundings with it. The tactile feeling of his mind tracing the gaps and grooves of the planks was intoxicating. If he focused harder, he could even tell which ones were dustier or full of scratches and dents. Elaine's aunt clearly hadn't swept behind the cupboards in weeks. It's fascinating, having this much control over your surroundings without spending a single drop of mana. He obviously wouldn't do it, but Percy knew he could bring the whole house down with ease if he wanted, without lifting a finger. It hadn't taken him long to discover that he could produce a domain while inhabiting Elaine's body. This wasn't even her domain. It was his own. He could only use it due to her grade, but it was made entirely out of his willpower, not hers. This chapter is updated by Novelfire.net. Had he known it would work like this, he might have chosen to possess his cousin instead of Nesha during the fight against the Blues. A big concern when inhabiting another's body was that he and his hosts were limited to the same shared mana pool. And since Elaine was better at manipulating her water mana than him, Percy would have only gotten in her way had he tried to pitch in. Evidently, the same restriction didn't apply to one's domain. As long as he possessed a body with a blue core or higher, it appeared he could generate a separate domain of his own. In hindsight, it made a lot of sense: 2 wills, 2 domains. Needless to say, he and Elaine would have made quick work of their opponents had they realized. This book's true home is on another platform. Check it out there for the real experience. Then again, he didn't really regret how things had turned out. Had he not been forced into a corner, he might have never merged his spells into the carnival. And Phoebe knew whether he would have survived this long without it. Not to mention that his clone had saved Nesha's life. his armor having protected her from a potentially lethal sneak attack. Granted, had he possessed Elaine instead, his girlfriend might have not even needed saving in the first place, but it was hard to guess how things would have played out in this alternative universe. Well, it doesn't matter. It's still a great opportunity to learn more about domains. This was especially relevant now that his main body was fighting blues on a frequent basis. Once this clone merged back into the original, his experiences were bound to serve as a good reference point. It still wasn't a priority, since he'd rather help Elaine master the dance and bring the knowledge back to Mickey as soon as possible. After all, Elaine wouldn't be his last blue host, so he could continue exploring the subject with his other clones in the future. That was why the two had prioritized the boosting art during the return trip. However, Percy had investigated a few things over the past couple of months. The first was obviously the possibility of transferring the domain to his main body via the ethereal cord. Had that worked, Percy wouldn't have even entertained the idea of leaving his cousin's body. Having a clone permanently stationed here would have been a small price to pay, in exchange for the ability to wield a domain whenever he wanted. On top of that, it would have given him the option of equipping all his clones with a domain too, besides the standard stash of fused mana. And he'd thought the odds of that working had been good. The soul mana he transferred to his clones and familiar already contained willpower, so why wouldn't he be able to send his willpower on its own? Sadly, reality was a cruel mistress. While he could indeed transfer his domain through the cord, it turned out that the exotic resource was a lot more evanescent than he'd expected, vanishing after the briefest moment of inattention. The mere act of trying to pass ownership to his main body caused 99% of it to dissipate. The scarce traces that made it to the other side didn't last very long either. He clearly wouldn't be able to as much as tickle his opponents with it, let alone having it survive inside his severed soul wisps for more than a second or two. I suppose that's why they call it a domain, and not soft mana or anything like that. The good news was that he'd managed to replicate some of the tricks his enemies had shown him. After discussing this with his main body, and whenever he and Elaine hadn't been able to practice the dance, he'd worked on molding the domain into a thin protective layer around his cousin's body, or a condensed blast powerful enough to shatter a large boulder. Neither he nor Elaine had made much progress with incorporating their understanding of their affinities into the ability, but Percy didn't even know if he would be able to do that while borrowing her body. Would he have to infuse the properties of his own mana types into it, or his cousin's? Either way, they weren't in a rush. Percy was about to resume his practice, when he noticed that his host had stopped talking at some point, as had the others. A quick glance revealed that everyone's plates were empty. Elaine's, her aunts, the husbands, and their adult daughters. And the woman had left the room at some point, when Percy wasn't paying attention. A minute later, she returned, carrying 4 wooden bowls in her hands. Looking at the thick, syrupy liquid glistening in a deep golden color, his borrowed mouth couldn't help but water. Elaine? Is that? His cousin smiled internally. It's part of the reason I wanted us to come here. I knew my aunt would treat us to some whistling sap. I didn't realize this until after you left for the Alchemist's Guild, but you've never tried it before, have you? I'm sorry I forgot during the trip to the temple. Percy chuckled inwards. I appreciate the sentiment, but you didn't have to bring us here for that. It's not a big deal. But Elaine shook her head internally, while thanking her aunt for the bowl on the outside. It is a big deal. I've said this before, but you can't spend your whole life training, Percy. I know the last few years have been hectic, but everyone needs to unwind once in a while. Even you. Even if it's just your clone bringing the memories back later. Relinquishing her control over her hands, she let him take over, to enjoy the rare dessert by himself. Moving the wooden spoon into his cousin's mouth, he tasted the sticky substance, its rich sweetness reminding him a little of Freddy's honey rolls. But the sap differed a little, as it left a slightly bitter aftertaste. It wasn't enough to deter the young children it was often given to, but it was more than sufficient to make the snack unique and memorable. More than anything, it was Elaine's nice gesture that filled Percy with warmth, however. Thanks, 'cause you're the best. Elaine walked along the dirt path, her fists clenched tight. She couldn't bring herself to enjoy the gentle morning sunlight or the cool breeze teasing strands of her hair. It was hard to do so, after the unsettling news her aunt had shared the night before. She and Percy had anticipated consequences, of course. Still, the revelation had shattered the warm, homey mood that had settled over the small hut during their shared meal. At the time, she'd wanted nothing more than to storm out of town and head straight to the mansion. In the end, she'd held herself back, opting to spend the night at her relative's home. It was what they had expected of her after weeks of traveling. In truth, she hadn't felt tired in the slightest. Not with Percy's trait eliminating the need for sleep. But that wasn't something they could afford to reveal. Percy's connection to their family was precisely the root of the trouble. He's worried too. Her cousin's guilt and anxiety bled through their connection, heavy and raw. But Percy had always handled negative emotions differently to most people. Instead of stewing in them, he turned them inward, training and pushing himself further. This was probably the correct approach too. Remir was a world where power spoke. What better way to deal with your problems than to strive for more strength? ssuvlfire.net. He was already back to practicing with his domain, since the area wasn't isolated enough for them to risk activating their boosting art. At least, my parents are okay. According to her aunt, their house was intact, having suffered no casualties in recent years. Their family was still immersed in a sea of trouble, of course, but that had to count for something. As long as her loved ones were alive, everything else could be fixed. I just hope Grandpa's alive too. Apparently, Archibald had slipped into the eastern side of the province not long after their departure. Leaving their family unprotected, even briefly, had been a massive gamble, but the results spoke for themselves. The mighty Violet had annihilated House Tantalus on his own, save perhaps for a handful of individuals who might have been away on missions. Assuming those people even existed, none had dared return. The massacre had marked the end of the centuries-old grudge, sparking a brief period of celebration. Even the towns formerly under House Tantalus's control had joined in, thrilled to be free from their cruel masters. Sadly, the moment of peace had been a fleeting one. Mere days after the destruction of the noble family, a second wave of rumors had rippled through the province. Archibald had left for the Alchemist's Guild, summoned by an envoy of the Divine Root to answer for his grandson's crimes. Following that, Galahad had stepped in as the acting patriarch, doing everything in his power to muddy the waters and to keep the neighboring provinces guessing. Denying the rumors about Archibald, he had claimed the Violet had merely secluded himself to work on his spells. The lie had bought them a few weeks, until people reported seeing him at the Fungal Spire. With the ruse exposed, the rival houses had pressured Galahad, forcing him to surrender the new territories. By all rights, the land east of the river should have fallen in House Avalon's hands. Every map worth a damn marked it as part of their province, and it had actually belonged to them too, in the past before the emergence of House Tantalus. More importantly, Archibald had been the one to reclaim it. The new towns were their spoils of war won fairly. Yet, the other houses hadn't cared for logic. Not in the face of benefits and a weakened competitor they could bully around. At least, Galahad's concession had bought their family some time. After splitting the territory between themselves, the other houses had calmed down. It wasn't due to kindness or mercy, though, that they'd stopped bothering them. Many of them were still licking their wounds, having fought wars of their own in recent years. For now, they'd agreed to take a step back to consolidate their gains. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time before their greed returned with a vengeance. The author's narrative has been misappropriated. Report any instances of the story on Amazon. Things aren't that dire yet, Percy suddenly said, probably guessing her thoughts. According to your aunt, Grandpa is still alive. When I infiltrate the guild, I can try to break him out. And our family is a lot stronger than those bastards think, even without him. Elaine nodded, but didn't say anything. She wasn't a kid anymore. She could tell Percy was just trying to cheer her up. They both knew things weren't as simple as he made them out to be. Rescuing Archibald would only provoke the Divine Root further. That was the very reason he'd surrendered in the first place, to avoid drawing their wrath down upon the family. And that was assuming he was still alive, or that the root wouldn't strike first even before the other houses did. As far as their strength was concerned, Percy had a point. Galahad had already been a very powerful blue, even before mastering circulation or getting the petal. Once he learned the dance too, he'd be as strong as a violet. Adding to that, their family had secretly gained another blue in her. She wasn't as talented, nor as experienced as her uncle, but with her boosting art and her second core, she should also be able to at least hold a violet at bay. If Percy stayed with her a while longer, they'd have an extra domain too. The problem was that they couldn't reveal any of this. Doing so was the same as admitting their lingering ties to Percy. Even if the news didn't attract their enemies' greed, it would certainly bring the Root's ire upon them. Having powerful trump cards didn't mean much if they couldn't use them. And when it came to politics and diplomacy, flaunting one's strength to deter their rivals was often as important as actually defeating them, if not more. I know it's not ideal, but we can at least protect ourselves if they dare invade. We just have to make sure not to leave any survivors. It'll raise a few eyebrows, but it's better than getting killed, he said. Nodding, she picked up the pace. It wasn't her job to figure this out. For now, her best bet was to report her situation to Galahad, get her hand fixed, and hear the man's opinion. Reaching the mansion didn't take long, the two spotting the nostalgic building later in the morning. Some moisture gathered in Elaine's eyes as her gaze lingered on the insignia of the two faces looking away from one another, carved in several spots along the wooden walls. More than the symbol itself, it was the thought of seeing her parents and her baby brother again that warmed her heart. Even if her grandpa's absence was bound to leave part of it empty. Stepping into the main hall, she scanned the room, spotting many familiar faces. Their eyes lit up in recognition too. Elaine had always been somewhat popular in the family, and her rare aquamarine-colored hair made it difficult to confuse her with somebody else. But the emotions in their expressions were complicated. There was a lot of relief. She guessed many of these people had worried about her over the years, oblivious to her fate or the reason for her prolonged disappearance. And there were flashes of concern, mainly whenever their gazes brushed over her missing limb. Yet that wasn't everything. She also spotted traces of anger and bitterness on some of them. I suppose I can't really blame them, she sighed. Elaine had technically abandoned her family in the middle of a war. Sure, Archibald had single-handedly ended said war shortly after, but she hadn't known about it when she decided to follow Percy. Her guilt had gnawed at her over the years, though she didn't really regret her actions. Her cousin had needed her more than the others. Percy would have never rescued Mickey without her. Ironically, the situation right now was the exact opposite. She'd chosen to abandon Percy, who was currently being hunted down by dozens of powerful mages, prioritizing her family instead. She didn't regret that either, though. Her cousin had grown strong enough to take care of himself, while it was their house hanging off a cliff this time. Shrugging, she walked around the room, greeting her relatives and telling them about her adventures over the past 2 years. Lying to them was another thing she didn't particularly enjoy, but she was doing it for their sake more than her own. To their credit, they all kept the interactions amicable. Even the ones who clearly harbored some resentment ultimately chose not to voice it. Many of the life users offered to heal her, but she told them she'd rather report to Galahad first. Her healer would inevitably notice her true grade during the treatment, which was another issue they'd have to deal with. They did have several blues with the life affinity, so fixing her up wasn't going to be very difficult. Even though their power and skill paled in comparison to Archibald's, it shouldn't take more than a few days. But she'd have to consult with her uncle to decide who to bring into the fold. She didn't distrust any of the family's leaders, yet every person who learned of their secrets was an additional risk. An hour later, Elaine knocked on Galahad's office. In the end, she hadn't stopped by her parents yet. As much as she longed to see them, she figured she should probably get herself healed before meeting her brother. Waiting a few more days was a small price to pay to avoid traumatizing the poor kid. The man replied almost immediately, having probably expected her. The commotion had already reached his ears, no doubt. Come in. Galahad was sitting behind the desk, at Archibald's usual spot. He appeared stronger than the last time they'd seen him. Even without consciously releasing his domain, the pressure he radiated was undeniable. He'd clearly mastered his new affinity already. The man was dressed sharply as always, without a single wrinkle visible on his silken trousers or his shirt, buttoned to the collar. His dark hair was neatly cut, and even the office itself was tidier than when Archibald had been in charge. But his eyes were tired. Evidently, exhaustion was the one thing he couldn't just tuck in place. A spark of relief still lit up in his pupils upon seeing Elaine, however. "Help me make sense of this," he said. "I've heard that your cousin has been killing blues. I assumed that had to be your doing, but not a single mention of you has reached my ears." Elaine shrugged, pulling a chair to sit across from her uncle. "Part of it was me," she admitted as Percy deactivated the controlled concealment runes on the bandages. Galahad's eyes widened at the sight of not only her blue core, but the second green one right underneath it. Yet she continued, "But make no mistake, Percy is more than capable of killing blues by himself. In fact, he's taken down several more since we parted ways. Luckily, it seems they haven't learned of my involvement, or I wouldn't have dared to return." Saying that, Elaine couldn't help but crack a smile, some pride bubbling up at her cousin's exploits. He'd already mostly closed the gap to her by the time he'd returned from the guild. The only reason she'd still been ahead of him was because he'd taught her circulation. And she'd only managed to remain stronger due to the new core he'd given her, and his help with her advancement. Percy was always grateful whenever she did some small gesture for him, such as celebrating his birthday, or getting him to experience some traditional snack he'd missed out on. Somehow, he didn't seem to realize how much more he'd done for her over the years. And even though the gap between them had widened once again, Percy was already working tirelessly to close it. Perhaps he'd be stronger than her the next time they met in person. Galahad took a few seconds to gather his thoughts before speaking. "We're in a ton of trouble. Your grandfather is held captive at the Alchemists' Guild, and the neighboring houses want our land. I've heard. I stopped by Pinesap Town on the W." "Uncle, I'm sorry," Percy butted in, taking control of her body. "This is all my fault. I don't regret keeping the Aurora Dew from the Order, but I should have never returned to the mansion after becoming a fugitive. If that bastard hadn't found me here, things wouldn't have been this bad." Elaine felt her cousin's voice choking in her throat. Of all the risky choices he'd made over the years, this was probably the one that bothered him the most. "Percy? Are you here too?" Galahad asked. He nodded. "Just one of my clones. My main body is still on the run. I'll hand Deimos the recipe right now if you think he'll release Grandpa." Galahad shook his head. "Don't. You were wise not to do that. The only thing giving Father the benefit of the doubt is the fact that we've denied all involvement with you. If they see you compromising to help us, it'll make the situation worse. Besides, things are somewhat stable for now." Percy raised an eyebrow. "If you find this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen. Please report the infringement." "How so?" "The Root has allowed us to visit Father a few times over the years. They've kept him and your mentor alive, since they're still trying to extract the information they want from them. Deimos is in a difficult position, because they've both refused to break under torture, and he can't risk going too far." "Why hasn't he harmed our family?" "Two reasons. First, he knows your grandfather has only surrendered to keep us safe. If he tries anything funny, Father will fight back. Also, our official position is that we've excommunicated you, condemned your actions, and complied with all their demands. Even for the Root, wiping out an entire family without evidence of wrongdoing would send an unsettling message to the other houses." "Is there nothing we can do to save Grandpa?" Elaine asked, her voice shaky. She didn't know if Galahad had realized who had spoken, but it didn't really make a difference. "Not for the time being. He wouldn't want us to worry about him either. He's entrusted me with keeping our family safe, and that's what I intend to focus on." Percy tapped her fingers on the desk, leaning back on the chair. "We might be able to help with that," he said after a while. Next, he took a few deep breaths, activating circulation. Galahad tilted his head at first, since this wasn't anything new to him, but his eyes widened as soon as Percy took the spell a step farther, countless azure bubbles feeding ambient mana into their channels. It's still incomplete, but we're getting there. We can explain how the water version of the spell works, though you'll have to figure the lightning and acid portions by yourself. I assume you've already worked out the circulation patterns for them. Naturally, Galahad said, a rare smile finding its way onto his face. How about Elaine's second core? Is it close to blue? She shook her head. Over 5 years with Aurora Dew, but I haven't brought much with me. 15 with the regular elixirs. Speaking of that, I'll need your help to buy my second daily dose. It doesn't have to come from the family's stash. I have enough resources to pay for it. All right, I hope I don't need to tell you how important it is to keep everything a secret. If you're forced to reveal your strength, make sure not to leave any survivors. Elaine nodded as Percy spoke again. What about her hand? She's been like this for months. Galahad sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The source of this content is novelfire.net. We'll get Isolde to do it. Of all our blues with the life affinity, I trust her the most. I suppose we can teach her the boosting art too. No sense in keeping it from her if she knows everything else. Father left me detailed instructions on the life pattern before leaving. Isolde was Galahad's younger sister, the third and final child from Archibald's first wife, and she was also a Yellowborn about 30 years younger than Galahad. Elaine hadn't interacted much with her, but her impression of the woman wasn't bad. With the pattern readily available and a life affinity to accelerate her physical conditioning, she'd learn the spell in no time. If she managed to figure out the dance too, they'd have 3 blues as strong as violets, even if they couldn't really flaunt them. That was enough strength to practically crush any lone family dumb enough to attack. Elaine could teach her father the dance too, since he already knew circulation and had the same affinity as her. Gawain was only at green, so the impact wouldn't be as great, but no family would say no to another blue-level combatant. If they got lucky, he might obtain a domain too with the spell active. She was about to get up, to let her uncle arrange everything, when Galahad spoke. Wait, there's something else I need to tell Percy. Her cousin flashed Galahad a questioning look, prompting him to continue. Don't beat yourself over what happened. Father was right to protect you, and so was Elaine. Noble families always encounter some resistance when they get their hands on a big opportunity, and they have to overcome it to grow. Usually, the trouble isn't as exaggerated as it is in your case, but then again, the rewards can't be compared either. Truth be told, you've helped us just as much as you've endangered us. I have, Percy asked. Father wouldn't have been strong enough to wipe out House Tantalus without your help. Those demons were a thorn in our side for centuries. Also, you're part of the reason why the other families haven't attacked yet. The rest of Remir might not be certain about your connection to us, but you still serve as a powerful deterrent. They're afraid of me? Galahad smiled again, for the second time this meeting. Why wouldn't they be? Noble houses are fixed in place, bound by rules and all sorts of concerns. But you're not. What's more scary than a criminal that freely roams the continent, slaughtering blues left and right? They're all hesitant to touch us. After all, what if you do care about your family? The amount of damage you can cause is significant. There were a few signs of them gathering their forces to invade a couple months ago, right until the news about the dead holy children spread. Percy nodded, but their uncle wasn't done. At the same time, this is only true as long as your main body remains free. The moment the divine root catches you, our enemies will no longer have any concerns. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? A wave of determination gushed through their connection, as Percy clenched their fists. I do. I won't get caught. Once again, Percy found himself in the space between worlds, shopping for a host. And just like many clones before him, his gaze eventually landed on a rather promising destination. Another lesser spring. Most planets in the universe were devoid of life. Had Percy been forced to sift through all of them, he would have never found anything useful. Thankfully, no lives meant no souls, and no souls meant that he couldn't even perceive those places via his current means. Consequently, most of the worlds he saw were teeming with life but no way for sapiens to advance, even if such planets were supposed to be relatively uncommon in the grand scheme of things. Lesser springs were rarer still, yet finding them was ultimately just a numbers game. He only had to keep searching for a couple of weeks at most, looking for a world with higher-graded souls. And Percy's current clone was clearly luckier than most, as he'd only brushed over a couple dozen planets before finding one that had piqued his interest. I seriously doubt it's a greater spring, though. There weren't enough people here in the first place, and the distribution wasn't very favorable either. Going from lesser to greater springs presented him with another massive challenge, as there were only a few hundred of those in the entire universe. Well, whatever. It's still worth checking out. This planet had everything from brown insects to gods. Percy spotted over a dozen deities. They were hard to miss, which meant that this place was among the most developed lesser springs he'd seen, surpassing Remir and, by extension, Huehue, Felmara, or Amanthes. Atlantis might have had more gods, but Percy hadn't paid as much attention to details like that during his earlier trips. He'd lacked the experience with his bloodline to properly examine a world, as well as the knowledge about the cosmos to make sense of the information. As for the vault, there was no doubt in his mind that Metatron had lots of gods and titans under him, but Percy usually entered the place through the portals and left it in a hurry, dragged away by his main body's pull. In hindsight, he did want to slap himself for not getting a better look at the artificial world during his first visit. Anyway, I have to decide who to possess. The only real options are yellows, greens, and blues. It would be pointless to go for anyone weaker, and borderline impossible for anyone stronger. Not to mention that he couldn't even spot any injured violets or whites at the moment. The blues were also scarce, but he did see a couple here and there. A higher grade obviously meant more knowledge and greater access to valuable treasures, but also more resistance, suspicion, and downright hostility. While Percy's clones had made a lot of progress practicing Zoraz's tricks, he didn't think he was quite ready to go for a blue just yet. He could latch onto a soul that had rejected him for a while, but forcing their connection to remain open wouldn't be easy. He could also suppress the blessing's effects on his mana for a couple hours, but it wouldn't last for the whole trip, nor could he extend this to his soul. Of course, it didn't necessarily mean that his host would be a bastard. They might be able to cooperate just fine, but the added risk wasn't worth it until he could handle himself a bit better. Maybe next time. Let's go with a green today. Observing his prospective hosts for a few minutes, Percy noticed something unusual. Many of them appeared stronger than they were supposed to be. He could still distinguish their grades with ease, but their souls seemed to have a strange quality to them that they had no right possessing. The healthy ones rejected him more adamantly, while the injured ones invited him more strongly. It was as if their very wills burned brighter, imposing themselves on the world around them. This wasn't exactly a new thing to Percy, because he'd long known that souls at blue or higher did this. He'd always assumed this was just a side effect of their domains. It was different here, however, in a bunch of key ways. While the reds, oranges, and yellows were completely normal, this strange situation seemed to affect some of the greens. Not all of them had it, and it was really subtle even for the ones who did, but it still made no sense to see something he'd associated with domains present in green souls. As for the people who were supposed to have domains, the blues and above, every last one of them had a significantly firmer will. Find this and other great novels on the author's preferred platform. Support original creators. Interesting. I doubt their greens have proper domains of their own, but they clearly have something similar. The fact that the difference was so small meant that this ability wasn't all that powerful at first. Yet, it seemed to have a massive impact on them after their promotion. Had these people learned of a way to train themselves at green, to give themselves a stronger domain down the line? Either way, this was worth looking into. There was a good chance that a lesser spring with so many gods would have a titan or two, so this weird ability might even be a decree he could steal. The only question was, how would he maximize his odds of getting it? This chapter is updated by novelfire.net. I need to pick a green host, but not just anyone, It's better if they don't have the ability yet, but are close to getting it. Every decree worked differently, but Percy felt his best chance to snatch one was at the very moment his host obtained their own copy. At least that was what he'd done with Enki. Had he possessed somebody on Atlantis who'd already had EA's gift, Percy would have probably missed out on the opportunity. Then again, it was entirely possible that this was the type of decree that had to be obtained from birth, like the one giving him his bloodline. If it was like that, then it was probably not the type he could steal in the first place. Scanning the Sea of Souls again, he looked for an injured green who lacked this unique quality. Knowing this was swiftly turning into a very promising trip, he didn't rush, taking his time to find a host in just the right condition. Eventually, a figurative smile formed on his non-existent lips. This one isn't injured that badly. Did they die from exhaustion or something? Percy hadn't even known it was possible for a green to work themselves to death. But this was good. If his host had killed themselves while training, there was a decent chance they had been trying to master the very ability that Percy was interested in. More importantly, they seemed rather young. Telling one's exact age through their soul wasn't that easy. Leaving aside all the differences between species, greens could theoretically live for thousands of years even without further advancements. Thus, the fact that Percy could tell probably meant he was dealing with a child. A green born? His heart would have skipped a beat if he had one. It was perfect. Percy had no idea what kind of amateurs would allow a kid this young. A holy child no less to die during training. But he couldn't think of a better host to help him accomplish his current objective. If this place was anything like Remier, a greenborn who'd never advanced had to be younger than 10. They clearly hadn't failed to master the ability due to a lack of talent, just due to their youth. Growing rapidly as they were, his host stood a decent chance of succeeding, especially with Percy's help. And he wouldn't be surprised if this person had a ton of backing. Even if we fail, saving the kid's life is the right thing to do. Not wasting another moment, he sank into the dying greenborn's soul. Fortunately, the kid's mind was present this time, and in a good condition too. Admittedly, their thoughts did appear a little groggy though. "I can save you if you let me," Percy said, cutting to the chase. Some surprise seeped through their connection, but his host didn't ask any questions, giving him a mental nod back. Percy didn't know if this was just the kid's personality, or if they were just too tired from all the training to engage in conversation. Whatever it was, he'd figure it out later. Weaving the preservation runes with practiced ease, he swiftly stitched the child's soul up, before allowing his senses to blend with theirs. Before he even opened his eyes, he pulled his status up, eager to see what he was dealing with. Undersir. Dua, Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1, green, fire. Mana core 2, seed. Spectral traits. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Insomnia eliminates the need for sleep. Spells. A soul-to-soul, crude. Spirit-forged cauldron, refined. A spectral art. Phantom scale regalia, masterful. Spectral art. Phantom spun silk, masterful. Alchemic principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. A pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. A deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Restructuring. Alter an ingredient's phase. A scaling. Brew a greater volume of ingredients at once. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Morai's decree, incomplete, grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's decree, open a one-way portal to the vault of magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. The decree, assuming that the native strange ability truly was one, hadn't appeared in Percy's status yet, but that was in line with his expectations. His host's fire affinity wasn't anything special either, nor did the boy seem to possess anything else of note. Percy would consider fixing the child's second core if the situation called for it. Having learned from his blunder on Melodia, he had cultivated a ton of green mushrooms inside the valley, carrying enough for a single person. That didn't mean he was running a charity, however. His seals had a limited capacity, especially in their thrice-divided state, and he couldn't replenish the ingredients as easily without access to an endless army of green and yellow beasts. He was more than happy to help an orphaned Redborn like Enki, or somebody fighting for their life like Mickey, Gabe, or Sol, but he didn't think his current host fell into either category. As a Greenborn, he was unlikely to need more power, and even if he did, his people might be willing to get him the life mana. For now, let's just see what I'm dealing with. Feeling his surroundings, Percy quickly realized he was lying face down, the ground covered in barbed plants. The traumatic memories of the demonic jungle flashed through his mind, causing him to inhale sharply. Opening his eyes, he exhaled in relief upon seeing that the mundane flora didn't resemble the insidious vines that had ravaged Torui village in the slightest. It was just regular-looking bushes, dry and full of tiny thorns. They prickled every inch of exposed skin, stabbing at his host's palms, forearms, feet, and even his face. Damn, these things look really sharp. Had the boy been human, his body would have been torn to shreds already. Luckily, Dua's skin was too hard for the thorns to pierce through. It appeared the hostile planet wasn't done harassing them just yet. However, pushing himself up, Percy felt the plants give way under him, crumbling more easily than he would have expected. The kid was too heavy. Was he wearing enchanted clothes or something? Percy frowned. No, it's not just the fabric. It's everything. Walking a couple of steps, Percy carved a pair of narrow lines through the bushes, their brittle branches snapping against his knees. His body must have weighed as much as a carriage. Picking a broken stem from the ground, he played with it for a few seconds, noting that it was heavier than a bucket of water. Dropping it, he saw it land way faster than it was supposed to. Is it the gravity here? It's several times stronger than Remir's. Many of the planets Percy visited varied in that regard, but the difference was rarely worth mentioning. It seemed to be a pattern worlds harboring life often shared similar properties. Or rather, it was probably the opposite. Life required certain conditions to prosper. Well, this place was clearly an outlier. Percy could still move around with ease, of course. Anything else would have been strange, given his host's grade. But he couldn't help but wonder how their Redborns survived. I guess their bodies are just built different from ours. Much like the Atlanteans could endure the crushing pressure of their abyssal kingdom, Dua's people had clearly evolved to handle the immense gravity of their planet, irrespective of grade. Eager to confirm his guess, Percy examined his host's hand, even pinching the dark brown skin at a couple of spots. Really strange. At first, he thought the kid's body was made of stone, but that wasn't quite right. It was flesh, just thicker and harder than he was used to. It consisted of several rough flakes too wide to be described as scales, but too small to be called plates, joined together in irregular patterns. They resembled a cracked patch of dirt that hadn't drunk a drop of water in years. Even the tiniest movement made all sorts of grating sounds that the boy seemed completely unbothered by. Dua was injured lightly here and there, some caked blood that looked no different from a human's marring his forearms and lower legs, a series of tiny scabs lining his knuckles. "Mister?" A youthful voice reverberated through Percy's mind, accompanied by a wave of exhaustion rippling through his soul. "Thank you for saving my life. But are you planning to stand here all day, staring at my hands?" Percy chuckled upon being reminded that he wasn't alone. "What's the story, kid? How did you end up dying?" he asked, though he didn't stop examining himself or his surroundings. The boy was wearing a set of yellow training robes. At least that was what Percy assumed they were. The fabric felt as thick and hard as his host's skin, though it wasn't in great condition either. It was full of holes and loose strings. Percy couldn't help but wonder how his host's clothes had ended up in that state, as he didn't think the thorned plants he had woken up on could have sliced through them. Stolen from its rightful place, this narrative is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. The tattered leggings hung about halfway down Dua's shins, the sleeves not quite reaching his elbows. The right panel of his tunic was pressed over the left by a green belt wider than the boy's fist. The ground wasn't flat. Percy was standing on a sloped surface, the brownish-yellow plants stretching as far as the eye could see, their thorns tips glinting under the gentle sunlight. Percy struggled to see past the peak of the hill he was on, but he spotted countless similar hills of various heights in the distance behind him. Two suns glared at him ominously, like a pair of crimson eyes. The largest one was already at its apex, the other not far from it. Unsurprisingly, it was rather hot, though the sky was quite dark for the time of day it was. It appeared the local stars radiated more heat than light. sysnovel-fire.net. I guess I pushed myself too hard, the boy replied, oblivious to Percy's thoughts. Next, he rubbed his head in embarrassment, Percy not feeling a single hair on his host's rough scalp. But it's not like I can help it. I've already delayed my advancement by nearly 7 seasons. It's a disgrace to my people. I won't be able to face my father until I earn Obatala's approval. Dua's words were somewhat vague, but they still corroborated many of Percy's earlier guesses. Is it too late to do that after you reach Blue? He asked, seeking confirmation. The boy nodded. It's not just too late. It's against the law to advance without it, and for good reason. How dare we mortals waste a Titan's efforts out of laziness? A bit harsh, isn't it? Percy asked, raising an eyebrow. The sentiment he could get behind. Every decree was a priceless commodity. If this one had to be obtained at Green, then it was clearly in these people's best interest to make damn sure they earned it at Green. Had Percy been in their shoes, he wouldn't have wanted to advance without it either. Still, forcing them to do it was a bit much. What if somebody simply lacked the talent to meet whatever the decree's requirements were? Were they supposed to spend their whole life stuck at the same grade? Even if they neared the end of their lifespan? Dua shook his head. It's only fair. Throughout our history, the number of fools who have complained about this arrangement could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Hearing that, Percy instinctively glanced at his host's hand again, counting his digits. Only 4. But the boy continued. After all, only Orangeborns or higher live long enough to reach Green or Blue in the first place. Advancing without the approval would not only amount to spitting in Obatala's face, but also tossing our heaven-given grades in the garbage. It would be disrespectful toward our Redborn brethren who don't even have the option. Millions of them would have sacrificed anything for the same opportunities that the rest of us have. And that is doubly true for a Greenborn like me. Percy nodded, appreciating the boy's sincerity and sense of duty, though he did feel like pushing back against the narrative a little. It's even harder for you though, isn't it? He asked. You're just a kid. You've only had your core for a few years, yet they expect you to accomplish something that even adults several times your age routinely struggle with. Dua quietly listened to Percy, not disputing anything he said. Only when he was done did the boy clench his fists, a spark of pride setting his soul ablaze. Indeed, but that is my responsibility as a favored one of Gallimus. I was born with more than most, so I have to give just as much in return. To be the shield that protects our people from harm. And to aspire for Obatala's heights. To stand shoulder to shoulder with the Titan one day, and thank him for his grace, with my chin held high. Percy whistled in amusement. The kid was pretty hardcore, but he didn't dislike it. He couldn't help but compare Dua to the Greenborns at home. His current host had more honor and virtue in his pinky than that entitled bastard Acton had had in his entire body. On Remier, the holy children were pampered, perpetually guarded by a large group of henchmen, and even allowed to commit atrocities with impunity. They spent their whole lives thinking the planet belonged to them, expecting everyone else to treat them like royalty. Meanwhile, it seemed that the favored ones on Gallimus showed kindness to their weaker brethren, putting their gifts in service of their society. No, it wasn't just the Greenborns who acted like this. Based on Dua's words, everyone treated even their Redborns with dignity. Percy sighed, wondering for a second what it would have been like to grow up here. But he shook the pointless thoughts out of his head. The time when he used to lament his lower birth grade was something he had already left behind. His bloodline was 100 times more valuable than a green core. Even if it wasn't, Percy would make it so. I'll be honest with you, Dua. Obatala's approval is the reason I came to this place. I didn't know what it was called at the time, but I might have not even looked for somebody to possess if it hadn't been for it. I hope you can let me stay with you until you earn it, he said, having no intention of deceiving the child. I understand. You are free to remain here until I complete my training, the boy replied, not hesitating for even a moment. Are you sure you're okay with giving an outsider access to something so valuable? I don't even know what impact my presence will have on you. For all we know, we might both fail to get it in the end. I'm not going to hold the fact that I saved your life against you. Dua insisted, however. Obatala has taught us to be grateful to our benefactors. If I were to selfishly push you away, I wouldn't deserve his approval. Percy chuckled. Something tells me that your Titan wasn't thinking of outsiders when he made that rule up. Aren't you worried about leaking the ability to other races? You should be more careful about trusting strangers. The boy shook his head. I haven't agreed to your request lightly. Even knowing the risks, I stand by my decision. Should you choose to betray my trust one day, it will simply be my responsibility to rectify my mistake. Perhaps you're the one who should think twice before stabbing a greenborn in the back. The corner of Percy's lips curled upwards as he found himself on the receiving end of the thinly veiled threat for a change. So amused was he by the child's courage and honesty, that he didn't feel like telling Dua about the greenborns he'd already killed. In any case, he'd already passed the Morai's decree to the child, which was already compensation enough for the arguably lesser decree he would be receiving in return. If the boy ended up missing out on Obatala's approval because of him, he'd just give him the mushrooms too. Good. Then I look forward to your success. As soon as they reached an agreement, Dua started moving. It didn't take Percy long to understand how the child had ended up brushing with death. The environment on Gallimus was quite harsh. The scorching heat and the crushing gravity were already difficult to endure, but that was merely the beginning. Each individual bush didn't offer much resistance, but trudging through hundreds of them slowly chipped away at his host's stamina. Whenever the loose ground under their feet gave way, sending them tumbling down the hills, the brittle plants failed to cushion their fall in the slightest. The awkward landings didn't hurt too badly, but each blunder set them back by several minutes, often forcing them to climb a hill twice or thrice. As a native, and a greened Dua was probably better equipped to handle the arduous journey than most, but every little thing still sapped away some of his strength, building up his frustration and his fatigue. It's reckless to ask so much of a child, Percy thought, but kept that to himself. He understood why they did it, of course. While he didn't doubt that many of their greenborns died during the harsh training, the few that made it to the higher grades were probably much more likely to attain godhood. Percy wouldn't be surprised if they made for stronger and nobler deities too. But he did struggle to understand how their parents were okay with this. Dua wasn't an orphan. He had a father waiting for him at home. Yet the man had clearly sent the child to his doom, and with no supervision to boot. SSBYNovelFire.net. In any case, Percy remained mostly silent during the first day, not wanting to bother the already tired boy too much. It wasn't until Dua took the initiative to speak that Percy realized his host could probably use the distraction to pry his mind off the hardships he had to endure. During their second day together, they talked about a wide variety of topics, giving Percy the opportunity to learn a lot more about Gallimus and its people. Days were longer than nights here, largely thanks to the presence of multiple suns. This wasn't his first visit on a planet like this, but the two stars were spaced farther apart than the ones on Felmara, stretching the days and eating into the nights some more. That said, the day-night cycle as a whole wasn't any longer than the one on Remir, which made it easier for Percy to compare the two worlds. At least that was the case for now, a strange distinction to make, but an important one considering everything else the boy had shared. Gallimus always required the same amount of time to orbit the twin stars, but everything else was fluid, from the number of days in a year, to their durations, and even the way they were grouped together. The Galimians didn't use weeks or months. opting to bundle their days directly into seasons. They did have warmer and colder seasons like Remir, but it was a lot more complicated than that. Apparently, their solar system contained dozens of planets, many of the larger ones orbiting near Gallimas. So close were they, in fact, that some of them were visible at night. Whenever Gallimas passed by them, their gravity tugged at the planet's surface, inflicting all manners of strangeness on Dua's world. Gallimas's rotation was often affected, stretching or shrinking days and nights in various ways. This also gave rise to devastating waves, mountain-splitting earthquakes, and calamitous hurricanes that often resulted in countless casualties and massive changes to the very geography of the planet. Even the gravity wasn't spared, fluctuating during the course of each day, increasing or decreasing depending on whether the heavenly body in question was above or below the Galimians' heads. According to Dua, the current year was divided into 17 seasons, further split into a total of 683 days. 10 of these seasons had elapsed since the Greenborn set out on his quest. He had been traveling for over 400 days, though he had only delayed his advancement by about 300, close to a year on Remir. It was ultimately just a drop in the bucket given his grade, but still a long time for the equivalent of an 11-year-old boy, bracing the wilderness by himself. Percy also confirmed that this place was indeed a lesser, not a greater, spring. They had elixirs about as effective as the ones on Remir, having relatively developed branches of alchemy and runecrafting. Sadly, Dua wasn't well-versed in either field, so Percy didn't know if they had discovered any alchemic principles he could master. He sighed. It might be nice to visit this place again in the future, but the priority is getting the decree. At the end of the day, alchemic principles were easier to learn, or even invent, while decrees were both rarer and infinitely more valuable. Obatala wasn't Gallimas's only titan, nor even their first one. He was, however, the only one whose decree affected the general population in such a direct manner, which was why Dua's people regarded him so highly. If you encounter this narrative on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Gallimas wasn't isolated from the rest of the cosmos like Amanthes, but they didn't have particularly strong ties to any other world like Atlantis or Felmara either. Based on what Percy had been able to gather, Dua's people were strong enough to defend themselves should any other lesser spring invade, but didn't possess anything valuable enough to entice any of their stronger rivals to take their chances. This meant that Gallimas was relatively peaceful, which was great news, because they already had their hands full with internal matters. Dealing with the catastrophic whims of their planet's orbit was a challenge in and of itself. In fact, Percy was convinced that this was the main reason Dua's people seemed so united and kind toward one another. One thing that Percy hadn't asked about just yet were the details of his host's training. Curious as he was, he had tiptoed around the topic, not wanting to remind the poor kid of his rumbling stomach or his dwindling stamina. He wasn't in a rush anyway. After all, he'd only been here for a couple of days, while Dua had been working on this for over a year. He didn't think they would be meeting the requirements anytime soon, so he tried to figure them out by himself. It wasn't until their third day together that he finally decided to be direct and ask his host about their purpose. The boy had been traveling in seemingly random directions and hadn't made any attempts to procure more food before they starved to death. They hadn't covered that much ground, as the constant climbing and rolling down the hills had slowed them down massively. Their surroundings hadn't changed all that much either. They'd been traversing the same bumpy sheet of dried bushes throughout. Just when Percy was contemplating the best way to breach the topic, Dua paused, picking something from the ground. It was a tiny bug, crawling on a broken branch by the boy's feet. Pinched between the child's fingers, the centipede-like creature squirmed, trying to break free. Percy barely got a chance to examine it. It was no longer than his host's thumb, encased in a glossy, black carapace. When the kid tossed the unfortunate insect into his mouth, chewing through the hard chitin loudly, Percy was just as creeped out by the act itself, as he was taken aback by its suddenness. Still, he didn't complain, feeling about as famished as his host by now. Sadly for them both, there was barely any meat on the small animal, scarce, salty morsels of flesh lost under the tasteless gravel of the fragmented exoskeleton. There should be more of them nearby, the boy said, consoling himself more than his guest. Not wasting time, Dua had already leaned forward, searching through the bushes for another snack. Or, we could just eat some of the food from my spatial seal, Percy suggested, and not for the first time. He didn't have that much on him, since most of his space was taken by the green mushrooms, but he definitely brought enough to last them a few weeks if they used it sparingly. If only his stubborn host hadn't refused his offer whenever he'd brought it up. The boy insisted that accepting external help would go against the spirit of the trial. Percy had been tempted to point out that, technically, Dua had already died, and would have stayed dead, if not for his external help. In the end, he chose to keep his mouth shut, however, realizing the kid was crazy enough to potentially kill himself out of shame if he said anything. To Dua's great joy, and Percy's mild contentment, they found a second centipede a few minutes later, and a third one not long after. Stuffing his face full of the modest snacks, the boy seemed to enjoy his first meal in days a lot more than Percy did. Only when he had his fill did he take off again, heading straight toward what Percy assumed was the source of the creatures. Dua, mind telling me what we're trying to accomplish here? You've been traveling at random without much of a plan. I doubt you're going anywhere specific, so am I right to assume this is some kind of hunting trip? Are we looking for a particular beast to kill? Not exactly, though fighting against beasts is one of the best ways to make progress. That's why I'm currently looking for the stronger centipedes, Dua said. Look, I'll explain everything later. It'll make more sense after you watch me fight. Percy nodded, guessing that the beasts were just a means to an end. They probably amounted to little more than practice dummies to help his host perfect some kind of obscure spell or technique. Though that didn't really explain why the kid had to spend a year roaming in the wild. Couldn't his people just bring him some opponents to fight? By the time the first of the two suns set, Dua located some higher-graded centipedes. The red ones were as thin and flat as his palm, though only half as wide. They were long enough to reach from the tips of his fingers all the way to his elbow. Meanwhile, the orange ones had a similar shape, but they were longer than Dua was tall. Their smooth shells looked very different from those of the mundane variants they had eaten earlier, however. Shimmering in a pale light, they appeared to be made of diamonds more than chitin, making Percy shudder at the mere thought of munching on them. At the same time, they possessed even more limbs than their weaker kin, their countless needle-like legs rhythmically stabbing through dirt and rock as the bugs sped toward the greenborn. Dua evaded the charging creatures with ease, pinning them and crushing them under the balls of his feet with some well-executed stomps, whittling their numbers down rapidly. Thankfully, he didn't try to eat any of them this time, probably realizing he'd only be cracking his teeth on their shells. Percy and his host advanced even more slowly than before, the centipedes growing stronger and more numerous with every hill they traversed. It wasn't until both crimson suns emerged from the horizon once again that they finally stumbled upon what Percy assumed were their targets. They had to be, given the boy's elation at the sight. Dua took on a fighting stance as he glared at the three yellow centipedes, as wide as the boy himself, but over twice as long as the child was tall. The creatures noticed them too. They surrounded the kid, cautiously closing in as their crooked mandibles clicked and clacked repeatedly, their sharp tips dripping with venom. Initially, the sight of their opponents hadn't left Percy particularly impressed. Novel fire net. A green mage, any green mage, even a young and inexperienced one, would have made quick work of a bunch of yellow beasts. Thus, he hadn't thought the ensuing battle would have posed much of a threat to his host's survival. Percy had simply assumed the boy had spent this long searching for the perfect sparring partners, just strong enough that they wouldn't die from the very first blow, but weak enough that Dua could disregard them with impunity. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong. As soon as the first of the three centipedes lunged at the boy, Percy realized that his host had no intention of unleashing his magic on the creatures. Sidestepping the blow, he barely avoided the pincer-like mandibles of the oversized bug, letting it cleave a wide path through the undergrowth. Yet, the greenborn didn't get a chance to catch his breath. as the other two creatures were already upon him. Dodging attack after attack, the child looked for an opening of his own. By the time the third centipede's lunge had missed, the first one had already recovered, beginning the cycle anew. The boy did an admirable job avoiding the deadly stabs of the creatures. He even put a lot of effort into stepping around the puddles of venom they left in their wake, the acidic substance making sizzling sounds as it burned the dry plants. Finding an opportunity to land his own blows proved hard. Dua handled his body better than most mages on Remir did, but he wasn't nearly as skilled in close combat as somebody like Percy or Mickey either. It wasn't until a couple minutes later that he managed to slam his fist onto one of their carapaces. The serpentine monster merely bent to absorb the blow, however, before snapping back in place, deflecting the boy's clumsy punch without as much as a scratch or dent on its shell. The only thing that Dua had achieved had been to tear the scabs off his knuckles, leaving a bloody imprint on the beast's smooth exoskeleton. Why isn't he using his magic? Percy wondered, though he kept the thoughts to himself, knowing it wasn't his place to question Dua's approach, nor to distract the boy during the fight. The Greenborn would have won already, had he unleashed his spells against the creatures. Even if the scorching flames had failed to melt right through their glossy shells, they would have certainly cooked the soft flesh lingering within. Let alone 3 yellow centipedes. Dua should have been capable of fighting 5 if he hadn't handicapped himself. The problem was that the child would be hard-pressed to achieve the same level of success with his bare hands. A sapient's power was mostly concentrated in their core. Sure, each advancement empowered one's body and sublimated their mind and soul, but the improvements couldn't compare with those that beasts experienced during their evolutions. Fueled entirely by their peculiar affinity, the bodies of magical creatures were essentially no different from spells themselves, after all. Even with a higher grade, Dua was at a severe disadvantage fighting like this. It certainly didn't help that he still had the body of a child, and that his opponent's exoskeletons were harder than those of other creatures at their level. Is he not allowed to use magic? In any form? Percy couldn't help but think back to the past few days. He had never once seen Dua release a single spark of fire mana from his core. At the time, he'd assumed that the Greenborn hadn't deemed it necessary, since he'd been able to deal with the weaker critters just fine. In hindsight, it seemed to go much deeper than that. Was that why they'd eaten everything raw? Percy had chalked that up to some cultural preference, or perhaps to his host not knowing how to cook. The boy didn't even carry a spatial storage device with him. It would have made everything so much simpler, and Gallimus definitely looked advanced enough to have those. And if they did, they should have equipped their Greenborns with them before anyone else. Stolen from Novelbin, this story should be reported if encountered on Amazon. If Percy's conclusion was correct, it would explain so much. Then again, Dua had already cheated somewhat by allowing Percy to bring him back to life. Soul-stitching was magic after all, as was the insomnia trait that had eliminated the boy's need for sleep. Actually, is that why he didn't seem all that excited when I offered to save him? Or when I told him about the trait? As stubborn and fixated on his people's ways as Dua was, it appeared he was still flexible enough to compromise when necessary. There wasn't a point to sticking to the rules if he was dead, after all. At the same time, he clearly intended not to indulge more than he had to. Thinking that his guess was spot on, Percy shifted his attention back to the fight. He wanted to see how the boy intended to get out of the mess, and why he'd chosen to get into it in the first place. Over the next hour or so, the child continued to avoid the deadly lunges of his harrowing opponents, finding more chances to land his own blows. While his body was a fair bit weaker than the creature's, the superior reflexes afforded to him by his higher grade still saved his life countless times. By now, the hard shells were more red than white, as Dua's desperate punches had done little more than slowly smearing them in blood. Percy was a little surprised that the boy hadn't changed tactics yet, as it didn't look like he would be penetrating the centipede's defenses anytime this century. Maybe that's not what he's trying to do. Percy could have offered a hand, of course, but he understood his host would have probably rejected his help. Instead, he racked his brain to decipher the child's intentions, to see how the brawl was related to Obatala's approval and the year-long trial to earn it. Eventually, he noticed something strange happening inside the boy's core. It was subtle, which was why he hadn't felt this earlier, but it seemed to repeat at certain moments. Observing his host carefully, Percy tried to figure out the pattern. 2 centipedes closed into Dua from either side. He leapt back to avoid them. Failing to find purchase, he tripped, sliding down the steep slope with the 3 creatures right behind him. The child didn't slow down until he neared the foot of the hill, at which point he managed to push himself up just in time to dodge another deadly blow aimed at his neck. Nothing. Throughout the arguably perilous exchange, the Greenborn's core had remained still as a lake. It wasn't until Dua moved to attack again that its contents trembled once more. Right when his fist was about to connect, some mana tried to ooze out of the organ, to spill into the channels leading to the boy's hand. But Dua didn't let it, ultimately keeping the mana firmly contained within his sternum. It's not whenever he moves, only when he tries to attack. But what is it? Indecision. Had the kid simply grown tired of the exhausting battle? Of the impossible trial the Titan had imposed on him? Was he considering violating the rules once more, to end the centipedes swiftly with a fireball? Having spent a lot of time talking to the boy, Percy somehow doubted that was it. But if it wasn't, it meant there had to be a deeper purpose behind the child's actions, something directly related to Dua's goal. Watching the fight some more, he soon came up with another guess. Maybe it's not the mana that he's trying to extract from his core. He's not allowed magic, so mana is just a nuance. Is he trying to separate his willpower from it? It certainly looked like Dua was trying to pull something out of his core, and mana just got in the way by sticking to it. Since the decree had something to do with domains, it wasn't all that surprising that the requirement would be related to them in some way. Then again, manipulating willpower on its own was precisely what a domain was. This was something only blues should be capable of. Didn't Dua need to earn the approval first before he could do this? The fight continued until well past noon. The boy was panting heavily by then. Luckily, his opponents had also grown tired, their black, compound eyes glaring at Dua with caution. They had halted their offensive at some point, no longer in a rush to attack. Sighing, the child turned away, finally deciding to call this a draw. The centipedes didn't chase either, seemingly agreeing that they weren't getting anywhere. Care to explain what that was all about? What were you doing with your mana back there? Percy asked. Dua didn't reply immediately. Putting some distance from the yellow beasts, he reached the outskirts of their territory, picking a few of the mundane variants up from the bushes to munch on. At least the red and orange bugs hadn't dared to bother him. Not after watching him spend the whole day sparring with their leaders. Only once the child had caught his breath did he respond. What else? I'm trying to awaken my domain. Percy was more confused than ever. His initial understanding of Gallimus was that their greens had to complete some task to be given their Titan's decree. That would grant them a domain, or a weaker version of one ahead of time. It wouldn't necessarily be very useful before their advancement, but it would turn them into stronger blues down the line. According to Dua, this wasn't quite right, however. Not only were their greens somehow capable of awakening their domain without the decree, this was exactly the requirement for obtaining Obatala's approval. Leaving aside the difficulty of the trial, that only begged another question. What did the decree actually do? Noticing his inner turmoil, the boy sighed. I don't understand this stuff that much better than you, so I'll just repeat my father's explanation. Long story short, domains are highly personal. Gods and titans might be able to give us things like blessings or bloodlines, but nobody can grant us a domain. That's something we have to produce by ourselves. So, is this not exclusive to Gallimus? Are you saying that every green in the universe can awaken their domain with enough effort? Dua nodded. Yes, but it wouldn't be very useful for most of them. That's where Obatala's approval comes into play. Can't give you a domain, but it can lock your domain in its strongest state. That's typically the only way for a green to retain and enhance it during their advancement. I'm not sure I'm following, Percy replied, scratching his head. He wasn't a complete stranger to domains. One of his other clones had already manifested one in Elaine's body, so Percy had had a chance to play with it extensively. He didn't have the corresponding memories, since his cousin's clone had yet to return by the time this one had left for Gaulimus. Still, the two sides had communicated a lot over the last couple of months, so Percy understood the elusive ability much better than he had in the past. Nothing he had experienced would suggest that a domain's strength fluctuated and had to be locked in its strongest state. His host scanned their surroundings, his gaze eventually settling on a rocky protrusion in the distance. Slowly making his way toward it, Dua remained silent for a few minutes, seemingly gathering his thoughts. Only when he took a seat on the boulder did the child resume his explanation. You can think of a domain as a large metallic gate that wants to remain shut. In this analogy, a blue would be like a burly adult. They are more than strong enough to open the gate with ease, and to keep it open for as long as they want, without worrying that it'll slam in their face. What about a green then? Percy asked. Dua shrugged. They're like a toddler. The gate wasn't built for them in the first place, so it would be exceedingly difficult for them to pry it open for even a moment. But not impossible. What if the toddler keeps ramming into the gate over and over again, using every muscle in their body? Perhaps they'll get lucky after 10 attempts. Or 100. Or 1,000. With enough patience and persistence, the gate will budge. Percy nodded, picturing the example vividly. The most update N0vels are published on Novel Fire Net. Is there a point to doing that though? Normally, no, Dua conceded. First of all, it's highly unreliable. Nobody in their right mind would try to use this in a fight. Your opponent won't let you try your moves 1,000 times on them. Even if it was more consistent than that, a green's domain is laughably weak. Going back to the analogy, the opening wouldn't be wide enough to even let the toddler through. They're better off relying on their mana instead. But that's not the point. You just want the gate to be open at the moment of your promotion, Percy realized. Exactly. Ultimately, you can think of Obatala's approval as a wedge. The effort to open the gate for the first time has to come from the toddler. But once they get there, the Titan's magic keeps the gate from closing. It still won't make the opening any wider, but it guarantees the toddler will have to put less effort when they grow up, allowing them to open a bigger gate. Okay, I guess that's where the analogy falls apart. But you get what I mean. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. Yeah, Percy muttered. Tearing a small branch off the nearest bush, he played with it in his hand, snapping its thorns one by one with his thumb as his mind raced with ideas. The boy didn't disturb him either. Domains are powerful, but they're also so much more than just weapons for blues and violets to wield. According to Nephthys and Zoriz, domains were one of the cornerstones of a deity's internal world, along with their cores. Percy could hardly imagine what an empowered domain might mean for his eventual ascension to godhood. Of course, he had yet to even earn the decree, and he was over a century away from green, let alone blue or divinity. Still, daydreaming never hurt anyone, and foundations had to be laid early. His host's explanation had raised even more questions, however. If a green could tap into their domain a full grade ahead of time, how would other things like second cores or boosting arts enter into the equation? Would they make it easier to unlock the ability? Elaine's domain had clearly been affected by both circulation and her second green core. Even though she hadn't tried to awaken it before blue, she had still been powerful enough to hold 4 blues back not long after her promotion. What about Nesha or Mickey, who had not only a green core like Dua, but also a yellow core in their abdomen and multiple instances of circulation? They should be even closer to their domain than Percy's current host, shouldn't they? The only reason they hadn't tapped into it was because they hadn't even known it was possible. What if their second cores reached green too? What if they upgraded their boosting arts into the dance? Percy was probably farther behind than his companions. Even though he was arguably stronger than either of them, he had surpassed them with skill and the sheer quantity of his mana, not its quality. His actual grade was twice removed from blues, so he was willing to bet that he wouldn't even qualify as a toddler in Dua's analogy. But what if he did? Could he enhance his domain twice more? First at green and then at blue again? Or maybe 4 times in total with each of his core's individual advancements? And would he be able to help his companions grow stronger too, through his clones? Probably wouldn't be that good. Even if he could cheat like this, he was bound to run into diminishing returns fairly quickly. But even a single boost had made a noticeable difference to the Galimian souls, enough for Percy to tell from afar. Regardless, all of this would need to be thoroughly tested. Well, let's get the decree first before worrying about any of that. I'll have a lifetime to explore its effects. Assuming I can bring it back to Remier, Percy shifted his attention back to the boy, who had courteously waited for him to finish thinking about the subject. So how are you meant to do this? It's ultimately just a question of effort and consistency. But my people have discovered a few tricks that help. Such as, enduring hardship, in all its forms, is the fastest way to hone our wills. Ironically, it's the one thing that we have in spades thanks to our planet's harsh climate. The gravity, the heat, the hunger, the weather, every little bit brings us a step closer to awakening our domains. The impact they have is minimal, but we only need a momentary spike in our willpower to earn the approval. Perhaps, it isn't an accident that Obatala chose this method to bolster our strength. Percy frowned, thinking of something else. Is that why you don't carry any supplies or spatial devices with you? To make things even harder? Partly. But there's another reason. We don't use magic because we need to suppress our instinct to rely on our mana. How can we expect to draw our latent domain out if our first reaction is to hurl fireballs at our problems? At the same time, we've learned that the easiest way for a green to manifest their willpower is to peel it off their mana. I'm guessing that's what you were trying to do against the centipedes? Percy asked, getting a nod back. It wasn't very surprising. Blues didn't need to go through so many hoops, as they had a lot more control over their willpower. They could just manifest it directly. Greens, on the other hand, couldn't even perceive it easily. The simplest way for them to access it was to extract it from their mana. After all, their cores passively attached their willpower to the substance as they converted the ambient mana to their own. To sum this up, your job is to go around fighting yellow beasts with your bare hands, enduring countless hardships while trying to separate your willpower from your mana, until you get lucky enough to manifest a short-lived domain. Pretty much. Percy nodded. Should Dua succeed, there was a chance he would also receive the decree, but he didn't want to leave that up to chance. Or at least, he would rather raise his odds as much as possible. Thanks to his time with his cousin, he knew that two people inhabiting the same body could manifest separate domains. This definitely applied to Blues, but he saw no reason why it wouldn't apply to Greens too. Starting today, I'll be working on the challenge alongside you. I'll try not to interfere with your control over your body, but I'll be going through the same hardships as you, and working to draw some of my own willpower out of your mana. If we time this correctly, we might be more likely to get 2 copies of the approval. Since that day, Percy worked alongside his host to develop his own domain, though he knew his efforts might ultimately prove unnecessary. Depending on how the decree got disseminated, he might receive his own free copy regardless. Still, he didn't want to risk it. He hadn't forgotten how close he and Enki had come to missing out on EA's gift. Had the totem in the assessment center not decided to shower them with a second portion of mind mana, they would have swum away with merely half of the decree each. And he didn't know if the mechanism granting Obatala's approval would be equally generous with a cheating outsider. The good news was that he didn't have to worry about Dua's survival as much. Young as he was, the Greenborn wasn't a complete amateur. He'd already spent over a year in the wilderness by himself, and he understood Gallimius's environment way better than Percy did. This gave Percy the chance to focus primarily on the happenings inside their mana core. He had a lot of ground to cover if he hoped to catch up to the boy. He's already made more progress than I thought, Percy realized a few days later. Dua hadn't yet managed to gather enough of his willpower to form even a semblance of a domain, but he had succeeded at extracting some of it from his mana. Percy hadn't been able to tell at first, because he had no way to detect somebody else's willpower directly. Even mapping out his own was somewhat challenging. He'd only discovered this by accident, while studying the child's methods. Whenever Dua peeled away some of his willpower from the mana, he left a small gap behind. Percy's willpower then rushed to fill it up, giving him an estimate of how much willpower the boy had extracted. Copying the Greenborn's exercises, Percy started tugging and pushing at the mana too, occasionally tearing a short-lived sliver of willpower from the core. This isn't as hard as I thought it would be. Percy had been afraid that he would never catch up to Dua in time for it to make a difference. The boy did have quite a head start on him, after all. Luckily, Percy soon realized that he possessed several major advantages of his own. To start, his willpower had already been honed to perfection, without having to go through all the hoops that Dua had been putting himself through. The boy's daily hardships might have been plenty for the average person, let alone a child, but they utterly paled in comparison to what Percy had subjected himself to over the last couple of decades. Ever since he discovered his bloodline, he had endured agonizing pain on a regular basis, be it during the creation of his clones, through the use of his boosting arts, or whenever he experienced his hosts, often gruesome, deaths. Beyond just pain, Percy had also spent an arguably unhealthy amount of time training, shared his beast hosts' crushing hunger, and carried a lot of stress and responsibility over his shoulders. Maybe winning the Masochist challenge isn't something I should be happy about, he thought, grinning sheepishly as he scratched the back of Dua's head. But I can't argue with the results. For original chapters, go to N0ve.fire.net. On top of having essentially graduated from the School of Hardship, Percy was better positioned to handle the domain too. He'd experienced several hostile domains over the past few months and even sliced through a bunch of them with his scythes. Furthermore, he'd even received some advice from his counterpart wielding a proper domain of his own while possessing his cousin. None of that could eliminate his current grade gap to a real blue, but these were things he doubted any other yellow or green in the universe had experienced. That said, developing his nascent domain wasn't the only thing on his mind. None of this would matter if the boy ended up dying before they succeeded, and their survival didn't depend solely on Dua's skill or experience. A lot of it came down to luck. The two had found more critters to munch on since the centipedes, so they didn't have to worry about starving to death just yet. But it did take them about a week to find a source of drinking water. The tail has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. Dua would have teared up at the sight of the narrow creek. If only his eyes hadn't dried out already. And Percy shared the sentiment. Sprinting excitedly towards the serpentine line of azure curving around the hills, splitting the bumpy plain in two, they gulped down as much water as they could fit in their stomach. Had the child been human, he would have definitely died of thirst by now, green or otherwise. Thankfully, Dua seemed to require much less water to stay hydrated. The liquid tasted a little different from what Percy was used to, likely thanks to Gallimimus's unique distribution of minerals, but he didn't care in the slightest, as this wasn't his first trip to an alien world. Having barely survived another obstacle threatening their life, Percy took the chance to evaluate his situation and plan for the long term. Based on what Dua says, he'll be awakening his domain a few months from now. At my current pace, there's a good chance I'll catch up by then. Percy had already observed and copied his host's methods enough to understand how it all worked. Of course, there was always a chance the boy would get lucky and pull it off as early as tomorrow, leaving Percy without the approval, though there wasn't much he could do about that. Even if their skill level had been equal, there was no guarantee they would unlock the ability at the same time. Wait, no, I actually do have a way to eliminate this uncertainty. Perhaps Percy would be giving the boy his second core after all. If they both improved enough to approach their goal, they could use the boost from the new organ to instantly lower the difficulty of the challenge, allowing them both to awaken their domains in quick succession. The problem was that the stubborn child would likely consider that cheating. Thankfully, Percy had an answer for that too. The second core would only affect the boy once it was filled up with mana for the first time. In theory, Percy could use the mushrooms to repair the Morai's decree, take some time to clear some of his host's new channels, and stop shy of the last step. Then, they could wait for Dua to awaken his domain fairly and squarely. Right when he was about to receive the approval, Percy would then fill the core up, hopefully giving him the push he needed to complete the challenge too. There were many things that could go wrong, and the mechanism granting the decree might not be one they could trick in the first place, but Percy was confident that this was the best possible approach in the face of the unknown. Now, he just had to convince his host to go through with it. The boy didn't really have a reason to decline. At the end of the day, a second core was a good thing, as long as it didn't interfere with Dua's morals. Then again, cheating his people's most respected titan out of a decree for the sake of an outsider wasn't exactly the behavior of an upstanding citizen. Percy mentally shook his head. Well, Obatala will have to suck it up. Gallimus is getting more than me out of this exchange anyway. Overall, Percy was happy with the plan. One thing he wasn't a fan of, however, was how long this would all take. He figured the boy could easily need half a year to awaken his domain. It would give Percy plenty of time to bridge the gap, but it also meant he'd be taking up one of his main body's cords for months. None of his clones had ever spent that long away, at least not from their perspective. Then again, he had so many more of them now, and each was busy with their own projects. The ones in Elaine or Nesh's bodies might return before he did, bringing back the water version of the dance or some new advancements in Magiscript. Percy had a second clone hopping from planet to planet alongside this one, so he might also discover something new that way. And even if none of that happened, his main body still had several other things to work on. At least, he didn't think his presence would be urgently required for the infiltration mission. So even in the unlikely scenario that he spent over 2 years here, the original should be fine. Hey, it's a decree we're talking about. It's definitely worth taking things nice and slow. The others will just have to manage without me for a while. Percy was looking forward not only to Obatala's approval, but also to the numerous breakthroughs he would experience once he fused into his main body. Having so many clones training in parallel was quite exhilarating. It gave him the feeling of progress even when he wasn't doing anything. Percy had essentially turned himself into an entire team of specialists, each of them working tirelessly toward their common goal. And the temporary lapses in memory only made the eventual surprises even more thrilling. The next couple of weeks passed relatively uneventfully, with both Percy and Dua making good progress. He even advised his host to stay close to the river this time, to make sure they had access to water and more food as they looked for more beasts to fight. Things had been going well, though that wasn't destined to last. One day, during their break from training, the boy warned Percy about something that he had honestly been expecting. Gallimus was finally about to enter a new season, and it was going to be a nasty one. Up until now, Percy had only experienced a relatively mild season on Gallimus, something akin to spring on Remir. The heat had been rising steadily, but it had remained bearable. Before today, the extreme weather effects his host had warned him about had yet to come into play. Suffice to say, Percy's shock was palpable when he saw the tide of dust and shattered vines sweeping toward them from the south, a towering cloud rapidly advancing over the hills. His first instinct had been to run, but it didn't take long for him to realize how foolish that would be. They'd never outrun a worldwide disaster. Bracing for impact was their only option. Even before the raging winds reached them, Percy felt dizzy. It was lucky he wasn't the one in charge of their body. Otherwise he would have fallen off balance by now. It was like somebody was pulling them toward a certain direction, trying to topple them. He'd been feeling like this since yesterday, though it hadn't been as much of a problem. Still, the tug had steadily grown stronger, and it was starting to get quite uncomfortable. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. His host had warned him things had been about to change, but he hadn't delved into too much detail. Dua sighed, shifting their gaze toward the orange-hued heavenly body looming in the northern sky, clearly visible even during the day. It had been growing larger over the past few weeks, until it eventually blocked out one of the 2 stars entirely. The smallest of the crimson suns hadn't risen today, and Percy suspected it wouldn't do so for a while longer. The prolonged eclipse had already plunged their surroundings into relative darkness and caused the temperature to plummet, giving Percy the impression that the heavens themselves were winking at them mischievously. "Due to our planet's current tilt, Vegas will be pulling us toward the north throughout the season," the Greenborn explained. "The sideways component of its gravity is why we're struggling to stay upright, and also the reason for the winds. Just try not to focus too much on your surroundings until you get used to it. I'll handle things for the next few days." Percy had more questions, but the violent tide struck before he could voice them. Dua dropped to all fours just in time to endure the crushing wave of dust, barely keeping contact with the ground. Thankfully, Galamus's natural gravity was strong enough to anchor the boy in place. Brittle chunks of plant matter rained down, but most of the debris shattered harmlessly against Dua's tough skin. Navigating the hill-covered plains would be annoying for the foreseeable future, but the storm seemed like it would be more inconvenient than downright dangerous. Despite the frigid temperature, the difficulty standing and the reduced visibility, Percy guessed that the local wildlife had probably long adapted to the planet's violent whims. Even the nearby creek looked mostly untouched. Water was far heavier on Gallimus, and the storm lacked the strength to lift the liquid over the hills encasing the narrow river. "Wow, you weren't kidding about the harsh climate," Percy said once he realized they were safe. "I can see how a green like you can handle it with relative ease, but how do your cities, or your Redborns, survive this stuff?" The boy shrugged. "Boreastrum, the current season, is admittedly one of the worst we have to deal with. Lower-graded people are usually advised to stay indoors while it lasts. Luckily, seasons this violent only come around once every 3 or 4 years. The rest aren't that bad. As for our cities, we build and enchant them with this in mind. I don't know what our ancestors did before we had a way to advance, but many of our gods and titans help nowadays, working tirelessly to minimize the damage." Percy swallowed hard, imagining how even the lofty existences standing at the very peak of Galamus's hierarchy had their hands full with this. But he didn't say anything, opting to resume his training. Sparring against the beasts would be a lot harder until the weather settled, which would rob them of the best opportunities to practice splitting their willpower from their mana. However, that didn't mean there was nothing they could do. Percy still had a few channels to clear, the boy having already allowed him to repair his second core. In fact, he had been quite excited to realize that Dua's new mana network didn't resemble any he had personally possessed, indicating that the boy's second affinity would likely be a rare one. Getting a feel for the exact mana type hadn't been easy, as it was mostly ambient mana from the outside that he was using to clear the channels. Based on the vague shape of the network, he thought there was a good chance it would be a life affinity. Unlawfully taken from Novelbin, this story should be reported if seen on Amazon. This chapter is updated by Novelfire.net. "This kid is probably the luckiest person I've ever met. Greenborn, saved from the brink of death, handed a second core without issue, and even my first host to ever get a rare affinity." He sighed internally. "But I suppose he deserves that much, given how nice and hardworking he is. It's such a pity my clones don't have my bloodline, though." While Percy clearly understood how much better his version of the ability was, he'd always wanted to play around with Archibald's version too. Had the petal he'd stolen from House Tantalus contained a life affinity instead of water, there was a good chance Percy would have eaten it himself, even sacrificing his pure affinity for it. Not that he'd ever regretted his decision to keep it, but he would have found it difficult to resist the temptation of not only a second rare affinity, but also one guaranteed to be compatible with his bloodline. Well, whatever. It's good for the boy. For now, let's just focus on getting the new core ready. Boreastrum was supposed to last for around 4 months. The lateral gravity pulling them north kept increasing during the first half, slowly climbing to a point that even Dua struggled with, at least for a few days. At the same time, the foreign planet had continued to enlarge in their vision, covering more and more of the sky with each passing day. Thankfully, Vegas never quite managed to conceal the second star, or the temperature would have dropped even more steeply, likely causing some serious trouble for the Galimians. Over the 3rd and 4th months, the planet looming over their heads gradually shrank again, the horizontal gravity it exerted over Dua's world weakening in the process. The temperature hadn't recovered yet, however, since Vegas was still blocking the first of the 2 suns, and would continue to do so until the very end of the season. The good news was that Percy and Dua had been able to resume their training way sooner than that. The storm they had endured at the onset of the new season had only lasted for about a week. According to the Greenborn, it had been caused by Vegas's gravity pulling much of Galamus's atmosphere to the northern hemisphere of the planet, only stopping once the pressure differential reached a tentative balance. Apparently, the reverse would occur at the end of the season, with a southbound storm returning the accumulated air to the southern hemisphere over the course of another week. That hadn't happened yet, though Percy wouldn't say he was looking forward to it. In any case, the end of the first storm had returned the visibility to normal, allowing Percy and his host to spar against the yellow beasts for most of the season. The extreme cold and the lateral gravity had still made everything needlessly irritating, but their targets had to endure the same conditions, leveling the playing field somewhat. At the end of the day, Gallimimus's fickle climate helped more than it hurt, as it offered them with another hurdle to overcome, and thus another opportunity to hone their wills. "I'm still glad this nonsense will be over in a few days," Percy told the boy over a meal. They had both made a ton of progress with their nascent domains, and Percy was confident he had already caught up to the boy. If they were to awaken their second core right now, they'd probably both have the decree by tomorrow. Sadly, Dua wouldn't hear it. Working towards the approval wasn't the only thing Percy had done, however. He had also hoped to stumble upon some gravity ingredients to bring back to Remir. Perhaps, he'd been silly to think they would be more common on a planet with strong gravity. But he'd still kept his eyes open. Having given all the mushrooms to his host, he had a lot more space in his seal, after all. His current favorite was a red plant with dozens of leaves rolled together like the petals of a rose. Curiously, it was a lot lighter than everything else on Gallimimus, which filled him with hope that it used gravity mana to fight against the planet's pull. Of course, even if it ended up possessing the correct affinity, his main body might no longer need it. Percy had been on Gallimimus for nearly 5 months, so there was a good chance his other clones had already beaten him to it. Even if the other clone currently roaming the universe had failed to find a gravity ingredient, the one residing in his girlfriend's body might have purchased one in Twilight City. Regardless, Percy didn't want to put all his eggs in one basket if he could help it. Leaving aside his ambitious plans of upgrading his boosting art to induce an artificial advancement, he was looking forward to registering the compression principle. Not only would it render his potions and his tattoos usable again, it might also raise his brewing yield, allowing him to get more Aurora Dew out of his stash of elixirs. Overall, Percy was more than happy with this trip. A few days before the end of the season, Percy and Dua appeared to have reached a critical point. They often found themselves gathering a near-tangible amount of willpower in their hands, the ethereal substance dissipating just half a step short of forming a nascent domain. Knowing they were both on the verge of completing the trial, Percy stopped training alongside the boy, to give Dua a chance to obtain the decree first. If Percy did it before the Greenborn, his host would likely refuse to awaken the new core, potentially missing out on the approval because of his stubbornness. Or maybe I'm just being paranoid and we'll both get it regardless, but it's better not to leave it up to chance. Over the next couple of days, Percy watched his host spar against one enemy after another, patiently waiting for the boy to take the final step. And sure enough, the Greenborn's year-long efforts bore fruit soon enough. Unfortunately, they did so at a most inconvenient time. Dua hadn't meant to screw Percy over. He was grateful to his guest, not only for saving his life and granting him a second core, but also for keeping him company all this time. Dua had tried not to dwell on it too much, but spending so many days alone had nearly driven him mad. That was why he'd decided to take a break from training upon noticing the towering cloud of dust heading south. The storm marking the end of Boreastrum would last for several days, and sparring against the beasts would be exceedingly difficult until the weather settled. Ideally, Dua had hoped for both himself and Percy to earn Obatala's approval. The last thing he'd wanted had been to cheat his guest out of the opportunity. If he completed the trial just as the storm was about to reach them, Percy would have found it much harder to follow suit. Sadly, that was exactly the position Dua ended up placing his benefactor in, albeit inadvertently. He wanted to slap himself for not having had the foresight to move away from the Syots before the storm. The round, orange-cored beasts he'd been fighting the day before weren't particularly strong on their own, but they were numerous and a terrible match for the harsh weather. Their bodies were just light enough for the violent gales to lift them off the ground and hurl them at Dua, yet just heavy and hard-shelled enough to punch deep craters wherever they landed, leaving the surrounding hills riddled with holes. The creatures hadn't attacked him out of malice, or even of their own volition. They'd simply curled up to shield themselves from the wind. The storm had done the rest, pelting Dua's position with deadly projectiles and forcing him to dodge by the skin of his teeth. He'd done a decent job at first, at least until the accident happened. Faced with a projectile shooting toward his face, Dua instinctively raised his fist to block it. He didn't think much of it as he repeated for the umpteenth time the same simple actions that had defined his life for the past year. As luck would have it, his desperation in that moment pushed him just over the edge, allowing him to extract ever so slightly more willpower than before, and to fold it into shape just a bit more neatly than all his previous efforts. Punching the orange creature out of the way, Dua stared at his hand in shock, feeling the invisible bubble of raw power already dissipating from around his fist. Any other time, he would have been elated to have finally achieved his goal, but right now, he wished more than anything to take that moment back. "Percy, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do the..." Dua didn't even get a chance to apologize properly for his blunder. Another orange creature was already upon him, forcing him to sidestep. At the same time, a deep rumble permeated the heavens, somehow penetrating through the cacophony of howling winds and the heavy thuds of the falling beasts. This chapter is updated by NovelFire.net. Casting a fleeting glance upward, he noticed that some of the rapidly drifting clouds were resisting the storm, forming a tiny island of relative calm above his head. The nebulous mass churned and rolled, gathering strength for something big. It was hard to make the details out through the screen of dust, but sporadic flashes of lightning illuminated it in glimpses. Dua felt a sigh escape his lips, but it wasn't his own. "Don't worry about it," Percy said. "Mind giving me full control of your body for a few minutes? We're running out of time." Dua barely managed to nod before Percy seized control of his limbs. Taking a few deep breaths, Percy raised their hand to filter the dusty air as best as he could, rapidly drawing mana to their abdomen. It felt strange, suddenly having mana of a brand new affinity flood channels Dua hadn't even possessed before. Percy dodged the incoming creatures with practiced ease, dancing across the battlefield as Dua's muscles brimmed with unprecedented power. Their senses sharpened and their feet grew lighter too, though Dua knew that last part was just an illusion. He must have weighed the same as before, or Percy would have struggled even more to stay grounded. In fact, the powerful gusts did carry them up the hill whenever Percy leapt, but he kicked off the loose dirt to return to their previous position every time. This text was taken from Novelbin. Help the author by reading the original version there. At first, Percy focused solely on dodging, at least until he saturated the new organ. Then, he began to actively seek out the Saiats, punching at them as he desperately tried to replicate Dua's success. Dua braced himself, expecting the blows to hurt as much as before, but the creatures no longer felt as heavy, nor did their shells feel nearly as hard. Percy's strikes boomed as they split the dust-laden air faster than arrows. Violent flares of mana burst from their chest with each throbbing heartbeat. Dua could even feel slivers of Percy's willpower peeling away from their mana, as his guest raced to gather enough of the elusive resource to complete the trial as well. But time was running out. Occasionally, Dua couldn't help but glance up at the roiling clouds. They had grown denser and deeper, arcs of crimson lightning flickering through them, painting the sky red as they prepared for their inevitable descent. "Come on! Almost there!" Percy's voice echoed through their soul, snapping Dua back to focus. Dua could feel how rapidly his guest was improving, their fists smashing through the shells like overripe fruit as they dashed headlong through the storm in search of more creatures. Like a grim reaper, Percy brushed across the battlefield, offering the Saiats' lives as sacrifices to the Titan's magic. Suddenly, everything flashed red. It took Dua half a moment to register what had happened. The first of the god's lightning bolts had struck him, planting something inside his skull. The sound came after, a deafening boom that nearly burst his eardrums and rattled his bones. At first, he thought that was it. But then came another bolt and a third. The Titan's mana didn't injure him, though it felt increasingly unpleasant. Like a hammer, it struck again and again, slowly carving something deep into Dua's very being. "Percy, are you getting this too?" he asked, his voice trembling with guilt. "Not yet," Percy replied, not with accusation or despair, but calm determination. There was something else too. A scarcely concealed spark of excitement, lighting the foreigner's soul ablaze. Something about the strangely colored lightning bolt had rekindled Percy's motivation, filling him with eagerness to press on. Planting a foot on a hard patch of ground, Percy carved a crater into the hillside as he launched toward another scythe with renewed vigor. Dua's eyes locked onto their targets with startling intensity, his guest's fists never missing their marks. Chunks of Percy's willpower flaked away one after another, rapidly draining the core in Dua's sternum, as a river of strength gushed through their arms. Dua couldn't feel Percy's domain directly, but he could sense its influence on his own flesh. Sure enough, Percy's relentless assault culminated in a violent blow that not only crushed its unfortunate recipient into bloody mist, but even continued to smash the one behind it, the force nearly shattering the bones in Dua's fist. Sorry for getting a bit rough toward the end. You've got a life affinity now. Fixing your hand should be a breeze, Percy apologized. Dua said nothing in response, not even caring about the minor injury. His gaze returned to the sky. The crimson lightning had ceased at some point, the clouds having started to disperse. But the heavens stirred once more following Percy's achievement, as though reconsidering whether a single serving had been enough. New arcs of lightning lit up, brewing a fresh round for someone who had arguably earned it. Neither the southbound rush of brown winds, nor the onslaught of orange critters had stopped, but Dua and Percy no longer worried about either of those things all that much. With two cores thrumming with power in their body, and their self-imposed restrictions now lifted, protecting themselves from the elements would be trivial. A second volley of lightning ensued, this time focused entirely on Percy. Unlike before, Dua's mind remained untouched, though his ears buzzed as they endured the booming noise for the second time in quick succession. Not that it made much of a difference. Like Percy had said, Dua was a healer now. The only sour note was that his second core was still at the very beginning of the green grade, while his first core was ready to advance. He'd need to discuss with his father, and possibly even Obatala himself, given his status as a favored one, to determine the best way forward. All of that could wait, however. Right now, Dua was more than happy to indulge in his reward. While they waited for Percy's own approval to settle into place, Dua tapped into the new feeling in his head, sharing his senses with his guest. Undersir. Dua. Mana cores. Mana core 1, green, fire. Mana core 2, green, life. Domain. Pulse, nascent. The storm raged on, occasional flashes of lightning piercing through the thick film of dust to hammer the new decree directly into Percy's mind. Uncaring about their success in the trial, the horrific weather would persist for another week, though it wouldn't really affect Percy all that much. Having achieved his primary objective on Gallimus, he'd be gone by then. His borrowed heart still thrummed with excitement as he thought back to the thrill of the last few minutes. Percy didn't really blame the boy for his blunder. Consolidating his domain at the wrong moment had been an honest mistake. Even if it hadn't been, Percy didn't feel like holding it against the child. All's well that ends well. If anything, he was counting his lucky stars for choosing to undergo the Greenborn's training regimen. Considering how things had gone, it really seemed like he would have missed out on the decree if he hadn't. The mechanism granting it had clearly been willing to ignore him until he met its strict demands independently of his host. In fact, Dua had probably done him a favor by putting him on the spot. Without the added pressure of fighting for Obatala's approval in the midst of the storm, Percy might not have succeeded. Despite his preparations and even cheating to fast-track the requirements, he had only made it in the nick of time. And Phoebe knew if the clouds would have deigned to reform for him, had he allowed them to disperse completely. More importantly, the new decree is even better than I thought. Percy felt the urge to rub his hands together. Back when Dua first told him about Obatala's approval, Percy hadn't known what to expect. Decrees came in all shapes and sizes, after all. It wasn't until he saw the deep red color of the lightning that Percy realized what he was actually dealing with. His status was about to get another upgrade. Had he shown his status to the boy during their first meeting, they might have figured this out sooner. Even Enki had known enough about EA's gift to identify Percy's status as something similar, and Dua was far more knowledgeable than the orphan. However, Percy had grown much better over the years at keeping his thoughts from bleeding through his connection to his hosts, and he hadn't thought to volunteer this information on his own. Regardless, it didn't matter. Compared to the other two mental decrees, Obatala's approval looked rather barebones. Aside from the child's mana cores, it lacked all the other sections that Percy was familiar with. The only notable addition was the dedicated domain section, which he guessed was related to the decree's primary function. That said, Percy knew he would be getting a lot more out of the decree than what its creator had intended. Still waiting for his own copy of the approval to settle into place, Percy turned his attention to his host. "Dua? Want to test your new toy?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, before clenching his fist. Kneeling, he punched the ground, raising a wave of dirt as he left a deep imprint into the soil. Most of the force had come from Dua's muscles, but knowing his host's physical limitations quite well by now, Percy could tell there had been a little extra layered on top. Interestingly, the child hadn't taken any time to prepare, nor had he bothered to pull any willpower from his cores. The new decree clearly allowed him to manifest a domain no weaker than the one he'd used against the beasts, and he could do it as easily as breathing. Frowning, Dua tried again, this time taking a few seconds to manually pull some additional willpower from his mana. Percy knew this was the case thanks to the gaps rapidly forming in the substance. This text was taken from Novelbin. Help the author by reading the original version there. Before long, the boy punched another hole next to the first, digging even deeper into the dirt this time, though the difference was admittedly small. Not satisfied with that, Dua repeated his actions a third time, leaving a crater as large as the second one, this time with no preparation again. "This is awesome," the Greenborn exclaimed. "Percy, are you seeing this? If I put in some effort to strengthen the domain, the extra power gets locked in, letting me use the upgraded version effortlessly from then on." Percy nodded internally, recalling his host's analogy of the heavy gate. Thanks to Obatala's approval, the wedge keeping the gate from closing, Dua could focus all his efforts into simply opening the gate farther. And whenever he gained another centimeter, he could move the wedge to the next spot too, incrementally strengthening the domain. "Keep at it. Let's see where the limit is," he replied. Obviously, the boy wouldn't be able to do this infinitely. The domain was still fueled by his willpower, which needed time to recharge. That was why the blues Percy had faced in the past had been limited to a few concentrated blasts at most. Clearly, Dua would be hard-pressed to achieve even that, or this would have been the most overpowered decree in the universe. Heeding his instructions, the Greenborn repeated his actions for a while, gradually pushing his nascent domain as far as possible, pouring another drop of willpower into it with each attempt. It wasn't until a couple hours later that he stopped improving, no matter how much effort he put or how many times he tried. The so-called pulse had already tripled in strength compared to when he first awakened it. It was quite an impressive upgrade, especially considering that Dua would be able to tap into this ability at a moment's notice. Content originally comes from novifire.net. Still, it wasn't even worth mentioning considering his grade, as even his strongest blast might struggle to overpower a yellow spell. In fact, Percy was confident his host wouldn't have even made it this far without his second core. Perhaps the ability would still be useful layered over a regular spell, yet it wasn't without its cost. By now, Dua's pulses had already begun to drain some of the willpower in his mana, so it was debatable whether they would even help more than they hurt during a fight. Overall, the child hadn't grown that much stronger. Ironically, the second core Percy had given him would raise his strength a lot more than the approval he'd spent so many seasons working towards. At the same time, they both understood that this wasn't the point of the new decree. The nascent domain wouldn't show its true value until after the boy's advancement. "Cool, let me try next," Percy said eagerly. The seed of his new decree had finished taking root inside his own mind, though he hadn't tampered with it just yet. He wasn't looking forward to the painful process of merging it into his status, and he also wanted to test whether he could access his domain without the approval. Nothing. Percy kept trying for a few minutes, But not a single drop of willpower gathered in Dua's hand this time. As he had suspected, each copy of the decree only worked for its owner. If he wanted to access the power he'd unleashed on the unfortunate orange beast again, he would have to do it manually. Okay, the approval is definitely handy, but we knew that already. I wonder whether it can lock my domain across different bodies, though. Probably not. If this worked, then Percy would be able to possess a violet or a white, manifest an extremely powerful domain using the borrowed body, and then use Obatala's approval to bring it back to his own. It was definitely worth testing, but he was almost certain it wouldn't work. Domains seemed to greatly depend on one's body and core, which was why he could manifest one in Elaine's body but not his own. Yet, they also relied on one's mind and soul, which was why he and his cousin or he and Dua had manifested separate domains while sharing the same body. Percy was willing to bet that Obatala's approval would only work for the whole package: body, mana core, mind and soul. If even one of those components were to change, the locked domain wouldn't be retained. That meant that Percy would still have to awaken his own domain if he wanted to have one. Sighing, he decided to stop postponing the inevitable. Locating the inert seed inside his mind, he willed what he imagined as a window to open, bracing himself for a world of agony. His only hope was that the 2, or rather 3, decrees would merge as smoothly as they had the last time. Much like with EA's gift, the window failed to open, a skull-splitting headache appearing in its stead. Percy didn't panic, however, having expected it. If anything, it didn't hurt as much as the last time, which had to be a good thing. Not missing a beat, he then willed his regular status to open, ready to commence the assimilation. Calling upon his trusty decree caused the pain to intensify somewhat, but it had yet to reach the heights it had during his visit to Atlantis. Even better, his status didn't remain silent this time, a message flashing before Percy's eyes, causing Dua's heart to skip a beat. Overlapping functionality detected. Calibrating Phoebe's decree. Status will remain unavailable while the assimilation is underway. Percy couldn't help but grin. Not only had the notification appeared immediately this time, instead of forcing him to keep trying for several minutes, the words were also crisp and readable, painting a stark contrast against the jumbled mess his status had inflicted upon him on Atlantis. Has it learned from its previous evolution how to better handle compatible decrees? Or does it simply have more raw power to bully Obatala's approval after devouring EA's gift? Either way, it was a testament to how supremely adaptable Phoebe's decree was. Percy had long known that its focus was the development of one's spells, but it appeared there was so much more to it than that. One thing that he hadn't paid as much attention to was how much better his status was than its competitors at recognizing and listing new elements. It wasn't perfect, since it clearly hadn't learned how alchemic principles, mutations, or domains worked before absorbing the other decrees, but it had still figured out a lot of things on its own. For example, Percy was damn sure that none of the 3 decrees had been designed with spectral traits in mind, nor with the intention of listing one's decrees, both Enki's and Dua's pages corroborating that conclusion. His status, even in its original state, was the only one that had seemingly comprehended those foreign concepts by itself. Another example was the way Percy's status had handled his clones and familiar. Granted, it was still a little rough around the edges, but just the fact that it had recognized those entities as extensions of himself, giving them specialized pages connected to his own, was quite impressive. I should thank her if I ever get the chance. Her decree certainly seems quite unique. Would the other 2 have even managed to merge by themselves? Somehow he doubted it. Had he obtained the 3 decrees in a different order, the results might have not been nearly as successful. Realizing how close he may have come to vaporizing his brain, Percy couldn't help but swallow hard. Regardless, none of that mattered now. Percy didn't think the calibration would be over before he returned to Remir, though he was confident the final step would also go more smoothly than the previous time. If the stars aligned, he might not even have to register all his entries again. Shifting his attention to his host, he remembered they would be parting ways soon. Dua, are you going to be all right by yourself? Percy felt somewhat uncomfortable leaving a child in the middle of nowhere. Not to mention that they were still in the midst of a storm. Of course, He also knew that was a silly concern to have, given everything else the boy had been through, most of it before their meeting. The two-cored Greenborn had already proven he could brave the wilds. Besides, the southbound winds had already stopped tossing living projectiles at them, having probably run out of Syattes a while ago. "Are you leaving?" the boy asked back, cutting through Percy's words. Percy shrugged. "Depends. How long will it take you to return to civilization?" "I don't know. I'm not sure where exactly we are, but I do know how to navigate. I suppose it'll take me anywhere from 30 to 50 days. Add a few more for the storm to end, since I don't feel like traveling through it." Percy leaned back on the carpet of barbed bushes, resting his host's head on the brittle plants as he contemplated his options. The wind still howled over them, but sticking to the ground wasn't as hard when they weren't jumping around. Even if the pressure flipped them over, it wouldn't hurt much. Taken from Novelbin, this narrative should be reported if found on Amazon. "I suppose I could stay a bit longer. Maybe visiting your cities would be worth my time," he muttered, though he shook his head soon enough. "Nah, I'd rather not risk meeting your gods. No offense. They sound like decent people compared to the deities I'm familiar with, but I don't know how kind they'll be towards an outsider. Worst case scenario, they might not let me leave. Also, I'm not looking forward to enduring this headache for months. The sooner I bring Obatala's approval back to my main body, the better." At the end of the day, this was just a lesser spring. Percy would be unlikely to find any resources to extend his lifespan or accelerate his advancements. From what the boy had said, it didn't seem like the other decrees the Galimians had would be very useful either. Sure, they might have a new alchemic principle for him to master, but he could just as easily find another lesser spring if he spent the same amount of time looking for one. Staying here came with too many risks and not nearly enough rewards. Sometimes, the best thing someone could do was to quit while they were ahead. The good news was that he wouldn't have to worry about Dua being mistreated by his people. Even if the Galimians weren't as united as the boy seemed to think, there was no way they'd harm one of their most promising Greenborns, a child who had not only completed Obatala's trial, but also obtained a second core with a rare affinity. In fact, Percy doubted he'd have to equip the boy with a concealment bandage. "I suppose this is goodbye then," Dua said, a hint of sadness seeping through their connection. Percy even felt the child's eyes burn a little. Had the Galimians' bodies contained more water, the boy might have teared up. "Only for now," Percy replied. "You'll become a god one day, won't you? We'll meet again out there." ssnovelfire.net. Perhaps, Percy's greatest gain from this trip wasn't the new decree he'd earned, nor the mysterious herb inside his spatial seal that he still hoped might contain some gravity mana. Rather, it was his new acquaintance. Percy didn't often think of his hosts as assets. Even the ones he'd enjoyed spending time with had been born at the lower grades, lacking the status or the influence to participate in interplanetary politics. The only exception so far had been Gabe, since he had just about crossed the threshold to be eligible for godhood, but the bar was also a lot higher in the vault, since they already had plenty of powerful gods and titans. Dua was different, however. There was a decent chance the boy would grow up into not only a god, but one of his world's leading figures. Or maybe not. The road to divinity was long and riddled with difficulties, while Dua was only a child. Still, he at least had the potential to make it all the way. Percy didn't have that many enemies outside Remir yet, or other than Raziel, but he was under no delusion that this would remain the case forever. As he continued to grow stronger, and once he began to infiltrate Greater Springs, he was bound to step on some toes. Thus, it wouldn't hurt to have some powerful allies too, just in case. Clenching his fists, the boy nodded, a wave of determination rippling through his soul. "I will, and I promise I'll pay you back for all your help." Percy chuckled. "You owe me nothing, kid. We've both benefited from our time together. I do hope we can stay friends though. Our people too. I'm not sure about yours, but mine could probably use a few allies." Methodically lifting parts of his wisp from the boy's injuries, Percy gradually gave up his access to his host's senses, allowing him to resume his recovery. Percy's vision darkened and his hearing deafened as the familiar tapestry of nearby souls appeared in their place. At the same time, he felt Remir's immense pull return with a vengeance, trying to snatch back the runaway soul that had stayed away for so many months. Remembering something, he latched onto the boy's soul for a couple more seconds as he spoke again. "Ah, I do have one final piece of advice for you." Dua didn't reply, but he perked up. "Try not to be so stubborn in the future," Percy said. "Rules are important, but sometimes it's okay to break a couple." Dua sniffed, seemingly saying something in response, but the words never reached Percy's ears. Letting go of the child once and for all, he allowed Remir to finally whisk him away, his soul drifting through the endless expanse. Percy's mind still buzzed with pain, Phoebe's decree chewing through it as vigorously as it did Obatala's approval. Yet, that did very little to dampen Percy's enthusiasm as he pondered over all the tangible benefits he was about to deliver to his main body. Leaving aside the modest willpower-infused pulses he might or might not be able to unleash, or his eventual promotion to blue that was still centuries away, there was something else he hoped the new decree would do for him a lot sooner. It would add a domain section to his status. For anyone else, this wouldn't have meant much. What difference did a few extra words make, when he couldn't yet tap into their true purpose? Except, Percy wasn't anyone else. He had a pair of mutated eyes that hungered for any source of information they could learn from. And if his guess was right, the interaction of Ie's and Obatala's decrees would lead to something big. Heron sighed as he gauged his companion's excited expressions. Being the only yellow-born in their little group, he was by far the youngest of the three blues. Shouldn't the roles have been reversed? Weren't his elders supposed to be the level-headed ones, and he the impulsive junior they had to rein in? I guess I can't really blame them. The Root had already raised their target's bounty twice since he started slaughtering his pursuers. It had come as a real shock to the noble houses, hammering home the fact that killing the holy children hadn't been a fluke, but a true testament to the Redborn's overwhelming strength. Few families had been able to join the hunt to begin with, and even fewer had dared to continue after watching their competitors lose their most prized assets one after another. Some even thought that the Root was in the wrong here, that the Greenborn boy had had it coming, and that Remir was blessed to have produced such a talented young man. But that was a minority opinion. Still, 200 million contribution points went a long way in persuading people to take their chances. A medium-sized family like Heron's could survive for several years on that alone. That was why many houses had doubled down on their efforts, sending even more people after the Redborn. The patriarch of Heron's family wasn't just thinking about the money, though. With House Tantalus out of the picture and House Avalon hanging by a thin thread, the entire Camelot province was ripe for taking. One of the main reasons Heron's house hadn't made a move just yet was because their target's ties to his birthplace were still up in the air. Disowned, excommunicated, on the run. All of that was true, but it wasn't like Archibald had had much of a choice in the matter. There was always a slim chance that Percival still loved his relatives and would sweep in to avenge them should anyone attack. Taking an entire family on would be impossible even for him, but the last thing any noble house needed was a blue-killing monster hunting their elites down one by one. And yet, here we are, delivering ourselves to him on a silver platter. Heron shifted nervously atop the stone slab he was using to fly. It was more spacious and arguably more comfortable than the rolling river or the strands of lightning carrying the others, but that did little to alleviate his worries. Scanning the expanse of scarce, snow-covered trees stretching beneath, he searched for signs of the fugitive or his pet, honestly hoping he wouldn't find any. The idea behind their mission was simple enough. The Redborn was unnaturally strong, yes, but not unbeatable. Many of the teams searching for him had reported something quite interesting. He always fled from groups with 3 or more blues, only engaging the smaller teams. One family had been dumb enough to only send a single person, their most talented mage, no less. To this day, they were still crying over their dead prodigy. In any case, this discrepancy spoke to the Redborn's limits. As strong as he was, 2 blues were clearly the most he could handle at once. The realization had further discouraged many noble houses from continuing the hunt. Bounty or not, 2 blues were already a huge investment for most of them, let alone 3. Some might have had the spare manpower before, but they'd lost their chance after recklessly sending a couple of their strongest people to their deaths. Currently, there were only a few dozen groups scouring the wildlands for the Redborn, each containing either 3 or 4 members. The great houses were the only ones who had sent multiple teams. At some point, their target was bound to grow tired or make a mistake, only to find himself cornered by a group he couldn't evade, or pinned down by several. Even if we find him, he'll just escape. We don't have the means to contain him, Heron muttered. Get full chapters from NovelFire.net. Are you still going on about that? Aunt Remilia asked. Twisting her palms, she adjusted the magnetic force holding her up, the bolts of indigo crackling around her hands as she drifted closer to him. We don't have to be the ones to kill the kid. We just need to put more pressure on him. Losing the bounty will sting, but our priority is to get him out of the picture by any means necessary. As long as we can gobble up a chunk of the province, it'll be worth it. If you come across this story on Amazon, it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. Heron nodded. He was about to respond when he caught something out of the corner of his eye. Jerking his head to the right, he saw a dark spot shooting rapidly toward them. A heartbeat later, he vaguely recognized the silhouette of a bird. Another beat after that, he saw the person standing on its back, seemingly dressed in simple clothes while confidently looking at them. Heron's blood froze in his veins, his heart working overtime to keep pumping it. It was him, and he wasn't fleeing. Clenching his fists, Heron let his fingernails dig into his palms, using the sting to jolt himself out of his stupor. What am I panicking about? We can still beat him. Even if Percival had suddenly grown bold enough to raise the bar, this was bound to be a tough fight for him. They should be fine as long as they remained careful. Unleashing his domain, Heron allowed it to unfold in a wide area around him, the others following suit, having also noticed their target. Soon, the oversized crow dove into the blob of willpower, its flying speed instantly having as a result. Not missing a beat, the yellow leapt off the creature's back, his arms spreading wide as he hurled over a dozen gray sticks in every direction. His muscles swelled and his skin reddened, as both his body and his constructs ignited, the gray flames devouring the ambient mana at a speed that would have made even a green blush. The sticks grew and shattered, filling the air with countless more copies. Stepping on the first pair of crossed shafts, Percival's body flared with mana for the briefest instant, before appearing on a different pair of sticks, tens of meters away. And he wasn't the only one. The Redborn's body was suddenly clad in a strange armor fashioned entirely out of his mana. An exact copy of him manifesting on a third platform in the opposite direction? Or wait. Which one was the copy again? They both looked the same. By the time the booming shockwave from Percival's first jump reached Heron's ears, the man's 2 silhouettes had turned into 4, already stepping on a 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th platform. Like a burning flower, the mana-forged army of phantoms bloomed outwards, each violent step rippling through the air like a thunderclap. At first, Heron thought the sounds would betray the original's location, but he couldn't have been more wrong. The cacophony of gleeful cries helped mask the source of the noise, as the images mixed and danced in a wild yet intricate formation, the Redborn's real body constantly disappearing into the growing crowd. Gritting his teeth, Heron forced his domain to expand farther still, his teammates mirroring his actions. The willpower covered an even broader region, enveloping several times the volume. Licking the fragile illusions, they had to be, right? With his will, Heron squeezed them from every direction, shredding them apart. There wasn't nearly enough force behind the paper-thin domains to injure the original, but that was okay, as long as they revealed his position. Yet, when Heron shifted his gaze back to his target, he only caught sight of 4 bursts of gray mana, each closer than the last, linked by a burning trail that led straight toward. Shit! Realizing the danger he was in, Heron hastily pulled whatever mana he could from his core, barely managing to coat his body in a thick layer of stone and willpower in time to block the scythe's vicious edges. The blades shattered violently against his defenses as the Redborn came to a halt on another platform behind Heron. The other blues quickly launched their spells at Percival, forcing him to retreat. Heron wasn't paying them any attention, however. He couldn't help but rub his neck, ignoring the sting as he felt the sticky liquid on his fingers and the pungent scent of iron filling his nostrils. Every hair on his body stood on end as he realized how close he had come to losing his life. All it takes is one mistake. Swallowing hard, he scanned his surroundings once again, determined to aid his companions. But what he saw shook him. Countless curved blades. A heron had no idea when Percival had even managed to produce so many, had pierced Yikin's defenses. The ominous visage of some ferocious creature enveloping the sharp constructs as they chewed through both the blue and the azure sphere protecting him. The domain-infused liquid might as well have been regular water. To his left, he saw the monstrous crow spin like a frigid tornado, barreling through Aunt Remilia's spells with ease. Indigo arcs of lightning zapped at the bird's manalit plumage, inflicting numerous nasty burns. But it didn't seem to care. Reaching her, it snapped its oversized beak around her torso, cleaving it right in half, a rain of blood and gore painting the previously pristine pieces of ice on its body crimson. By the time Heron had wrapped his mind around the carnage, he felt something pierce through him, a crescent blade sticking out of his chest. It hadn't drawn a single drop of blood this time, but the pain was agonizing as it tore through his very being with ease. Barely turning his head enough to look over his shoulder, he caught a glimpse of the man's glowing eyes, their slit pupils cutting through him as everything turned black. So, this is him, huh? Heron wondered, a bitter smile forming over his lips. This was the alchemist who had invented the Aurora Dew and slain 2 holy children. The yellow who had killed over 20 blues and turned their world upside down. The fugitive worth 200 million points, along with his harrowing pet. Percival Avalon, the Spectral Reaper.